From a silent palace coup in Hanwha Dynasty China to candlelit stakes in Tudor England, this is a haunting yet soothing journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with how Empress Lu Ji turned a rival concubine into a living horror, and move deeper into why empty iron stakes still seem to press as burn in Mary Eyes, London. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the light, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Lu Ji of Han. In the sprawling palace complex of Chang'an, where red lacquered pillars held up the weight of a nascent dynasty, power wore the face of a woman who had learned its language through decades of careful observation. Lu Ji, later known as Empress Dowager Lu, began her ascent not with the dramatic flourish of conquest, but with the patient accumulation of influence that would eventually drown the early Han court in blood. The year was 195 BCE, and Emperor Gaozu lay dying. The founder of the Han dynasty, the peasant who had toppled the mighty Qin and established one of China's greatest imperial houses, was slipping away from a wound that refused to heal. In the shadowed chambers where incense burned low, and physicians whispered in hushed tones, Lu Ji watched and waited. She had been his empress for decades, had borne him a son, had navigated the treacherous currents of palace politics while he carved out an empire. Now, as his breathing grew shallow, she prepared to seize the reins of that empire for herself. Lu Ji's path to power had been neither swift nor simple. Born into the minor nobility, she had married Liu Bang when he was nothing more than a local magistrate with grand ambitions and a talent for inspiring loyalty among the dispossessed. Through the chaos of the Chu-Han contention, as her husband battled the aristocratic Xiang Yu for supremacy over all China, she had learned the brutal arithmetic of survival. When Liu Bang's forces suffered defeats, it was often the families of his generals who paid the price. When victory seemed impossible, it was political maneuvering and strategic alliances that turned the tide. Lu Ji absorbed these lessons, filing them away for future use. The empress had observed how her husband's concubines wielded their own forms of influence, how princes born to secondary wives could pose threats to the succession, how the emperor's favor could shift like morning mist. Most importantly, she had watched as concubine Qi, young and beautiful and clever, began to whisper in Gaozu's ear about replacing Crown Prince Ying with her own son, Ruyi. These whispers had not gone unnoticed, and Lu Ji had begun to prepare her response long before her husband drew her final breath. When Gaozu died in 195 BCE, the transition seemed smooth enough on the surface. Crown Prince Ying ascended the throne as Emperor Hui, dutiful son to his imperial mother. But those who understood the true mechanics of power recognized that the real authority now resided in the Empress Dowager's apartments, where Lu Ji held court behind screens of silk and spoke through the mouths of officials who owed their positions to her patronage. The purges began almost immediately, though they unfolded with a methodical patience that made them all the more terrifying. Lu Ji had spent years identifying potential threats to her family's hold on power, and now she moved against them with surgical precision. Princes who might have challenged her son's legitimacy found themselves recalled to the capital on various pretexts, only to die of sudden illnesses or hunting accidents. Generals whose loyalty seemed questionable were reassigned to distant posts or simply disappeared from the historical record entirely. But it was the fate of concubine Qi and her son Ruyi that would cement Lu Ji's reputation for cruelty and serve as a warning to any who might consider crossing the Empress Dowager. Qi, who had once danced for the emperor and whispered sweet poisons about succession, found herself imprisoned in the palace complex, her beautiful robes replaced with the rough hemp of a servant. Her son Ruyi, briefly Prince of Zhao, was summoned to Chang'an and housed in quarters that seemed luxurious, but were, in reality, a gilded prison. Emperor Hui, still young and perhaps retaining some affection for his half-brother, initially protected Ruyi by keeping him close at court. But even the reigning emperor could not shield the boy forever from his mother's implacable will. When Hui left the capital for a hunting expedition, Lu Ji struck. Ruyi was found dead in his chambers, officially from illness, though the court's whispered consensus spoke of poison, administered with the efficiency that would become the Empress Dowager's signature. For concubine Qi, death would have been a mercy. Instead, Lu Ji devised a punishment that would echo through Chinese historical memory for millennia. The former concubine was subjected to a fate so grotesque that even the court historians, accustomed to recording the casual brutalities of imperial politics, struggled to find appropriate language. Her limbs were severed, her eyes gouged out, her ears destroyed, and her tongue cut away. This mutilated thing that had once been a woman was then thrown into a latrine and left to die slowly, a living embodiment of what happened to those who threatened the Lu clan's supremacy. The court reacted with horror, but it was a horror mixed with understanding. Emperor Hui himself, upon seeing what his mother had done, reportedly wept and declared that such cruelty was inhuman. Yet he took no action against the Empress Dowager, perhaps recognizing that her methods, however monstrous, had eliminated challenges to his throne that might otherwise have led to civil war and the deaths of thousands. With her primary rivals eliminated, Lu Ji turned her attention to consolidating power more broadly. She installed members of her own clan in key military and administrative positions, created a network of spies and informants that extended throughout the empire, and gradually reduced her son's role to that of a ceremonial figurehead. When Emperor Hui died in 188 BCE, possibly from the strain of living under his mother's terrible shadow, she installed a series of child emperors, each more pliable than the last. The Lu clan's dominance seemed complete. Empress Dowager Lu had transformed from the wife of a rebel leader into the de facto ruler of one of history's greatest empires. Her relatives held military commands, governed provinces, and controlled the flow of information to and from the throne. For 15 years, she maintained this grip on power through a combination of political acumen, strategic marriages, and the ever-present threat of violence that her treatment of concubine Qi had made terrifyingly real. But power built on fear and family loyalty alone carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. When Lu Ji finally died in 180 BCE, the elaborate structure she had constructed began to collapse almost immediately. The Liu princes, who had spent years quietly building their own networks and nursing their grievances, moved with surprising speed and coordination. Within months, every member of the Lu clan who had held significant power was dead, their bodies scattered across the empire they had briefly ruled. The counter-coup was swift and merciless, but it was also necessary for the survival of the Han dynasty. Lu Ji's methods had preserved her family's power for a generation, but at the cost of creating deep resentments and fundamental instabilities that threatened the empire's long-term survival. Her legacy was thus paradoxical. She had been instrumental in consolidating Han rule during its vulnerable early years, yet her very success in eliminating rivals had created the conditions for a violent reaction that nearly destroyed the dynasty she had sought to protect. ANULA of ANURADHAPURA. On the island of Lanka, where monsoon rains fed ancient reservoirs and Buddhist monasteries dotted the landscape like scattered jewels, a queen discovered that poison could be as effective as any army in securing a throne. ANULA of ANURADHAPURA would earn her place in history, not through conquest or administration, but through a carefully orchestrated series of murders that transformed the royal palace into a charnel house and shook the very foundations of Sinhalese kingship. The year was 47 BCE, and the Anuradhapura kingdom was entering a period of instability that would last for decades. The great reservoir systems that supported the island's agriculture were functioning smoothly. Trade with Indian kingdoms across the Pork Strait continued to bring wealth and exotic goods, and the Buddhist Sangha maintained its role as both spiritual guide and political counselor to the crown. Yet beneath this apparent prosperity, the royal succession had become a source of continuous conflict, with rival claimants and their supporters locked in increasingly deadly struggles for supremacy. ANULA began her rise as the queen consort of King Coranaga, a position that should have provided her with influence and security, but left her ultimately dependent on her husband's continued favor and survival. The politics of the ANURADHAPURA court were complex, involving not only the immediate royal family, but also powerful noble clans, wealthy merchants who controlled the island's trade networks, and Buddhist monks, whose support could legitimize or undermine any ruler's claim to divine sanction. What distinguished ANULA from other royal women of her era was not her ambition, which was common enough among those who lived in proximity to absolute power, but her willingness to employ methods that shocked even a court accustomed to political violence. When King Coranaga died, whether from natural causes or from assistance provided by his loving wife, ANULA moved immediately to secure her position. Rather than retiring to a life of comfortable widowhood or accepting marriage to Coronaga's successor, she chose a different path entirely. The Queen Dowager's first victim was King Tissa, Coronaga's successor, who survived his coronation by mere months before succumbing to a mysterious illness that left court physicians baffled and suspicious. ANULA, displaying a grief that impressed observers with its apparent sincerity, mourned the kingdom's loss while quietly arranging her marriage to the next king, Kalanaga. This pattern marriage, followed swiftly by widowhood, would define the next 5 years of Sinhalese history. Kalanaga's reign lasted just over a year before he too fell victim to the same mysterious ailment that had claimed his predecessor. The symptoms were consistent: sudden onset of severe stomach pains, followed by fever, delirium, and death within days. The kingdom's physicians, trained in both traditional Sinhalese medicine and techniques learned from Indian practitioners, found themselves helpless against whatever curse seemed to have settled upon the royal palace. With each successive marriage and widowhood, ANULA's position grew stronger rather than weaker. Instead of being seen as a figure of ill omen, she managed to present herself as a stabilizing force in an era of unprecedented royal mortality. Her marriages to kings Kalanaga, Kalatanaga, and others served to legitimize their brief reigns, while positioning her as the continuity between dynasties. Meanwhile, the actual mechanism of her influence, a sophisticated understanding of plant-based poisons available from the island's rich botanical resources, remained hidden from all but her most trusted servants. The Queen's methods extended beyond the royal bedchamber to encompass anyone who posed a threat to her plans. Noble families who supported rival claimants found their patriarchs dying under suspicious circumstances. Buddhist monks who questioned the legitimacy of her successive marriages discovered that even the sanctuary of the monastery could not protect them from ANULA's reach. Court officials who showed too much curiosity about the pattern of royal deaths were reassigned to distant provinces or simply disappeared from the administrative records. But perhaps most disturbing was ANULA's willingness to eliminate her own lovers once they had served their purpose. The Queen, despite her successive marriages to kings, maintained relationships with various courtiers and foreign merchants who caught her fancy. These men, initially elevated by royal favor to positions of unexpected prominence, learned too late that ANULA's affections were as dangerous as her enmity. Palace guards would find them dead in their chambers, victims of the same mysterious illness that claimed kings, their bodies bearing the telltale signs of systematic poisoning that had become the Queen's signature. The Buddhist chronicles of later centuries would struggle to understand ANULA's motivations, finding it difficult to comprehend how a woman could orchestrate such systematic violence without apparent ideological or religious justification. Unlike other murderous rulers who killed in the name of political necessity or religious duty, ANULA seemed driven by a pure love of power for its own sake, a desire to control the mechanisms of succession that treated human lives as mere obstacles to be cleared away. The Queen's downfall came not from any clever detective work by court officials or intervention by surviving nobles, but from the simple exhaustion of public tolerance. After 5 years of royal deaths and the increasingly obvious pattern of ANULA's involvement, the people of ANURADHAPURA began to murmur that their kingdom had fallen under a curse. The Buddhist monks, initially cautious about challenging royal authority, grew bolder in their denunciations of what they saw as a violation of the Dharma, so fundamental that it threatened the spiritual foundations of the kingdom itself. The uprising, when it came, was swift and decisive. Led by a coalition of surviving nobles and supported by Buddhist monasteries whose abbots had grown tired of conducting funeral rites for poisoned kings, the rebellion captured the royal palace in a single night. ANULA, perhaps recognizing that her methods had finally exceeded the boundaries of what even an absolute monarchy could sustain, made no attempt to flee or negotiate. The queen's execution was designed to match the horror of her crimes. She was burned alive on a pyre built in the palace courtyard, the same space where she had welcomed 5 successive husbands and countless lovers to their deaths. The flames that consumed her were said to burn with unusual colors, fed by the aromatic woods and spices she had once used to mask the bitter taste of her poisons. ANULA's reign of terror lasted only 5 years, but its impact on Sinhalese political culture would endure for centuries. The chroniclers who recorded her story struggled with the unprecedented nature of her crimes, finding no adequate precedent in Buddhist literature for a woman who killed not from passion or desperation, but from what appeared to be pure malice. Her example would serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked royal power and the importance of maintaining institutional safeguards against tyranny. The dynasty she had nearly destroyed through her serial murders was eventually restored, but the kingdom of ANURADHAPURA never fully recovered from the instability her actions had created. The 5 years of her influence had shattered traditional patterns of succession and created lasting suspicions about the role of queens in royal politics. Future rulers would be more cautious about the women they married, and court protocols would be adjusted to prevent any single individual from gaining the kind of unchecked access to royal persons that had made ANULA's murders possible. Cleopatra 0. Along the banks of the Nile, where ancient gods still watched from temple walls and the great lighthouse of Alexandria cast its beacon across the Mediterranean, the last pharaoh of Egypt played a deadly game of dynastic chess that would determine not only her own survival, but the fate of the Ptolemaic kingdom itself. Cleopatra 7th, Philopator, remembered by history primarily for her legendary beauty and her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, was in reality a cunning political operative whose rise to absolute power was paved with the bodies of her own siblings. The Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals after the conquest of Egypt, had ruled from Alexandria for nearly 3 centuries by the time Cleopatra was born around 69 BCE. The family had maintained power through a combination of military skill, administrative competence, and a willingness to embrace the strange customs of their Egyptian subjects while maintaining their essential Greek identity. Most distinctively, they had adopted the pharaonic tradition of sibling marriage, reasoning that this would preserve the divine blood of the royal line, while preventing the kind of succession disputes that had torn apart other Hellenistic kingdoms. But the very institution that was supposed to prevent civil war had, by Cleopatra's time, become a source of continuous conflict. Each generation of Ptolemaic rulers faced the same fundamental problem: how to maintain unity between siblings who were simultaneously spouse, co-ruler, and potential rival. The solution, refined over 3 centuries of practice, involved a delicate balance of shared authority, carefully distributed power bases, and when necessary, the selective elimination of family members who posed existential threats to the dynasty's survival. Cleopatra's education had prepared her for this reality. Unlike many of her predecessors, she had learned to speak Egyptian, in addition to her native Greek, had studied the religious traditions that legitimized pharaonic rule, and had observed firsthand how her father Ptolemy XII had navigated the treacherous currents of Roman politics to maintain his throne. She understood that survival as a Ptolemaic ruler required not only intelligence and charm, but a willingness to employ violence with the same calculated precision that her ancestors had used to build the great library of Alexandria. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, the succession appeared straightforward enough. Cleopatra, as the eldest surviving child, would rule jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, whom she would marry according to family tradition. The arrangement followed patterns established by previous generations and should have provided the kingdom with stable leadership during a period when Roman power was expanding throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But the 18-year-old Cleopatra had no intention of sharing power with a 10-year-old brother, regardless of ancient custom or political convenience. From the beginning of their joint reign, she systematically excluded Ptolemy XIII from meaningful decision-making while working to build her own independent power base among Egypt's priesthood, military commanders, and the merchant classes who controlled the kingdom's vast wealth. The civil war that erupted between the siblings in 48 BCE was sparked by immediate political pressures, specifically the question of whether Egypt should support Pompey or Caesar in Rome's ongoing civil war, but its deeper causes lay in Cleopatra's fundamental rejection of the power-sharing arrangements that had previously allowed the Ptolemaic dynasty to function. She had concluded that the old system of joint rule was no longer adequate to meet the challenges facing Egypt, and that only absolute monarchy could preserve the kingdom's independence in an age of Roman expansion. Cleopatra's alliance with Julius Caesar provided her with the military support necessary to defeat her brother's forces, but it also created new complications. The Egyptian queen's relationship with Caesar was simultaneously personal and political, designed to secure Roman protection for her throne while maintaining Egypt's formal independence. When Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile in 47 BCE, officially while fleeing from Caesar's advancing troops, few observers doubted that his death had been arranged by his sister to eliminate a continuing source of dynastic instability. The pattern established with Ptolemy XIII would be repeated with even greater ruthlessness in Cleopatra's treatment of her second brother husband, Ptolemy XIV. Elevated to co-ruler status as a teenager following his older brother's death, Ptolemy XIV represented the same fundamental threat to Cleopatra's authority that his predecessor had posed. As long as any legitimate male heir survived, the Egyptian queen's position remained vulnerable to challenge by domestic rivals or foreign powers seeking to install a more compliant puppet on the pharaonic throne. Ptolemy XIV's death in 44 BCE, coinciding conveniently with the assassination of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra's need to secure her position during a period of Roman political chaos, bore all the hallmarks of careful planning. The young pharaoh, barely 20 years old, succumbed to what court physicians described as a sudden illness, though the timing suggested a more deliberate cause. With his death, Cleopatra was free to elevate her son Caesarion to the status of co-ruler, transforming the Ptolemaic succession from a source of internal conflict into a tool for legitimizing her dynasty's connection to Rome's most powerful families. The Egyptian queen's willingness to eliminate her own brothers reflected a broader transformation in Ptolemaic political culture during the final century of the dynasty's existence. Earlier generations of rulers had generally managed to balance the competing demands of sibling rivalry and dynastic unity, finding ways to share power that preserved family solidarity while maintaining effective government. But the increasing pressure of Roman expansion had made such compromises impossible, forcing each ruler to choose between accommodation and elimination. Cleopatra's choice was unambiguous. Rather than accepting the constraints of traditional power-sharing arrangements, she systematically eliminated every potential rival within her own family, while building new forms of legitimacy based on religious authority, economic prosperity, and strategic alliance with Rome's ruling class. Her methods were often brutal, but they were also effective in achieving their primary objective: the preservation of Egypt's independence during the final decades of Ptolemaic rule. The Queen's relationship with Mark Antony represented the culmination of this strategy, combining personal attraction with hard-headed political calculation. Antony controlled Rome's eastern territories and commanded the military resources necessary to defend Egypt against potential rivals, while Cleopatra offered access to Egypt's vast wealth and the legitimacy that came from pharaonic traditions stretching back to the time of the pyramids. Their alliance, formalized through marriage and the birth of 3 children, created what appeared to be an unassailable power base spanning the entire eastern Mediterranean. But the very success of Cleopatra's strategy contained the seeds of its ultimate failure. By eliminating all potential rivals within her own family and binding Egypt's fate so closely to Antony's fortunes, she had created a situation where her kingdom's survival depended entirely on the outcome of Rome's civil wars. When Octavian's forces defeated the combined Egyptian and Roman fleets at Actium in 31 BCE, Cleopatra faced the choice between submission and death. Her decision to commit suicide, following Antony's example after their final defeat, was consistent with the ruthless pragmatism that had characterized her entire reign. Rather than allowing herself to be paraded through Rome as a captive or accepting whatever client status Octavian might have offered, she chose to end her life on her own terms, taking with her the last vestiges of independent Egyptian monarchy. The deaths of Cleopatra and Caesarion in 30 BCE marked the end of both the Ptolemaic dynasty and Egypt's existence as an independent kingdom. But the Queen's legacy extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of her actions. Her systematic elimination of dynastic rivals had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of absolute monarchy as a response to external pressure, while her relationships with Caesar and Antony had shown how personal alliances could be transformed into instruments of state policy. Later, Roman historians, writing under emperors who had inherited Octavian's victory over the Egyptian queen, would tend to emphasize the exotic and sensual aspects of Cleopatra's reign, while downplaying the calculated brutality that had made her political success possible. But the contemporary evidence suggests a ruler whose methods differed little from those employed by other successful monarchs of her era, distinguished primarily by the skill with which she adapted traditional dynastic practices to meet the unprecedented challenges of her time. Agrippina, the Younger. In the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill, where the scent of burning incense could not quite mask the odor of fear and ambition, Julia Agrippina the Younger orchestrated a campaign of murder that would place her son on the imperial throne and earn her a reputation as one of history's most ruthlessly devoted mothers. Born into the chaos of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, where family dinners were exercises in survival and maternal love was often indistinguishable from political calculation, Agrippina transformed the domestic art of poisoning into a precision instrument of statecraft. The Rome of the 1st century CE was a city where power flowed through bloodlines that traced their ancestry back to gods and heroes, where the distinction between private family matters and affairs of state had been obliterated by generations of emperors who treated the empire as their personal inheritance. Into this world, Agrippina was born around 15 CE, daughter of the popular general Germanicus and great-granddaughter of Augustus himself. Her pedigree was impeccable, her education thorough, and her opportunities for advancement seemingly limitless. What distinguished her from other well-born Roman women was not her circumstances but her willingness to employ any means necessary to secure her family's position at the apex of imperial power. Agrippina's early life had been shaped by the peculiar dynamics of imperial succession, where proximity to the throne was simultaneously the greatest advantage and the most dangerous liability any Roman could possess. Her father Germanicus had been beloved by the legions and the people, making him both an asset and a threat to the Emperor Tiberius. When Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances in 19 CE, possibly poisoned on Tiberius's orders, Agrippina learned her first lesson in the deadly arithmetic of imperial politics. Popularity without power was a recipe for assassination. The young woman's subsequent marriages were exercises in strategic positioning rather than romantic attachment. Her first husband, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, brought her wealth and senatorial status while fathering the child who would eventually become Emperor Nero. Her second marriage, to Gaius Sallustius Crispus Passienus, lasted only until his convenient death provided her with additional financial resources and greater independence. Each relationship served to advance her political objectives while maintaining her position within the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized the imperial court. But it was Agrippina's third marriage, to her uncle Claudius in 49 CE, that provided her with the platform necessary to implement her most ambitious plans. Claudius, recently widowed after the execution of his previous wife Messalina for treason, was looking for a spouse who could provide political stability and help him manage the increasingly complex challenges of governing an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. Agrippina, despite the canonical prohibitions against uncle-niece marriage that required special senatorial dispensation, offered exactly what the emperor needed: impeccable bloodlines, political acumen, and a demonstrated ability to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics. The marriage gave Agrippina access to the inner workings of imperial administration, while positioning her son Nero as a potential successor to Claudius's own son Britannicus. But influence and proximity were not enough to guarantee the succession she envisioned. Roman imperial succession, despite its apparent hereditary character, remained fundamentally unstable, dependent on the complex interplay of military support, senatorial approval, and popular acclamation. Agrippina understood that securing Nero's eventual accession would require not only careful political maneuvering, but the systematic elimination of anyone who might challenge his claim. Her first target was Lollia Paulina, a wealthy senator's daughter, whose beauty and political connections made her a potential rival for Claudius's affections. When Paulina was accused of consulting fortune-tellers about the emperor's health charge that carried implications of treason, Agrippina ensured that the investigation proceeded with unusual thoroughness. Paulina's subsequent exile and forced suicide eliminated a potential threat, while sending a clear message to other ambitious women about the dangers of crossing the emperor's wife. But Agrippina's most audacious crime was the murder of Claudius himself in 54 CE, an act that required careful timing, meticulous planning, and a sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics that would determine Nero's acceptance as emperor. The historical sources, primarily Tacitus and Suetonius, suggest that Agrippina employed a professional poisoner named Locusta, who had perfected techniques for administering lethal doses of toxic mushrooms in ways that mimicked natural death from digestive ailments. The emperor's final meal, served in the intimate setting of a private family dinner, included a dish of mushrooms prepared according to Agrippina's specific instructions. When Claudius began showing symptoms of poisoning but failed to die quickly enough to suit his wife's timetable, she reportedly employed a backup method, a feather dipped in concentrated poison, ostensibly used to help the emperor vomit, but actually designed to ensure his rapid death. Claudius's demise allowed Agrippina to manage the succession with characteristic efficiency. While court physicians were still puzzling over the emperor's sudden illness, she had already secured the support of the Praetorian Guard, arranged for Nero's presentation to the Senate, and begun the process of deifying her deceased husband. The transition appeared seamless, a testament to months of careful preparation and the loyalty of key military and political figures who had been cultivated through a combination of patronage and intimidation. But Agrippina's most chilling act was yet to come. Britannicus, Claudius's son by his previous wife, represented the most serious long-term threat to Nero's legitimacy. Despite being younger than Nero and lacking his stepmother's political connections, Britannicus possessed the advantage of being Claudius's biological heir, a distinction that could prove decisive if political circumstances shifted or if military commanders began questioning Nero's fitness to rule. The elimination of Britannicus required different tactics than those used against Claudius. The young prince was healthy, surrounded by loyal servants, and watched closely by senators who remained skeptical about the circumstances of his father's death. Agrippina's solution demonstrated both her growing sophistication in matters of murder and her willingness to involve her son directly in the family business of assassination. Working again with the poisoner Locusta, Agrippina developed a plan that would eliminate Britannicus during a public banquet, in full view of the imperial court. The method was ingenious in its simplicity. Britannicus's food taster would sample a hot drink that contained no poison, but when the prince requested that cold water be added to cool the beverage, that water would carry a lethal dose of toxins that would kill him within minutes. The plan proceeded flawlessly. At a dinner attended by Rome's most powerful families, Britannicus collapsed and died while reaching for his cup. His death so sudden and dramatic that witnesses later described it as divine punishment for some unknown offense. Nero, displaying the acting skills that would later make him notorious, expressed appropriate grief, while ensuring that his stepbrother's body was quickly removed and cremated, before any detailed examination could be conducted. With Britannicus dead and her son secure on the throne, Agrippina might have expected to enjoy the fruits of her carefully orchestrated crimes. But power built on murder carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, and the methods she had used to secure Nero's position would eventually be turned against her by the very son she had sought to protect. The relationship between mother and emperor began to deteriorate almost immediately after Nero's accession, as Agrippina discovered that her son was unwilling to remain the grateful puppet she had envisioned. Their conflicts, initially focused on policy questions and court appointments, gradually became more personal and vindictive, with each side seeking to undermine the other's position while maintaining the appearance of family harmony. Nero's eventual decision to murder his mother in 59 CE represented both the logical culmination of the political education she had provided and a repudiation of the maternal authority that had made his rise possible. The staged shipwreck that was supposed to eliminate Agrippina while providing the emperor with plausible deniability failed when she managed to swim to shore, forcing Nero to resort to more direct methods. When Praetorian guardsmen finally cornered her in her villa, Agrippina reportedly offered her womb to their swords, declaring that they should strike the body that had borne such a monster. Her death marked the end of the most successful political career achieved by any woman in the early Roman Empire, but it also represented the failure of her fundamental strategy. By teaching Nero that murder was an acceptable tool of statecraft, and by eliminating all potential rivals to his authority, she had created a monster whose appetite for violence would eventually consume not only his enemies, but his own family, friends, and supporters. Agrippina's legacy would influence Roman politics for generations, establishing precedents for imperial women who sought power through manipulation and violence, while demonstrating the ultimate futility of such methods. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrupting effects of absolute power, but it also revealed the limited options available to women in a political system that offered them influence only through their relationships with powerful men. Boudica of the Iceni. In the mist-shrouded forests of eastern Britain, where ancient oaks sheltered druidic groves and Roman roads carved straight lines through landscapes that had known only Celtic paths, a queen's public humiliation would ignite a conflagration that nearly drove the legions back across the Channel. Boudica of the Iceni, whose name meant victory in the ancient British tongue, would earn her place in history not through the patient accumulation of political power, but through a campaign of vengeance so savage and complete that Roman writers would struggle for adequate language to describe the carnage she unleashed upon their supposedly civilized world. The Britain that Boudica inherited was a patchwork of tribal kingdoms in various stages of accommodation with Roman rule, a frontier province where the eagles of the legions cast their shadows over societies that had remained essentially unchanged since the time of Julius Caesar's expeditions a century earlier. The ICENI, occupying the flat, fertile lands of what would later become Norfolk, had initially welcomed Roman protection as a shield against their more aggressive neighbours, particularly the Catuvelauni, who controlled much of southeastern Britain from their stronghold at Camulodunum. Boudica's husband, King Prasutagus, had navigated the complexities of client kingship with considerable skill, maintaining the forms of Celtic authority while accepting the practical limitations imposed by Roman oversight. His kingdom prospered under this arrangement, with Iceni craftsmen producing the fine metalwork and jewelry that made their territory valuable to Roman merchants, while Iceni warriors served as auxiliary troops in campaigns along the northern frontier. The arrangement seemed to offer the best of both worlds: protection from enemies, access to Roman markets, and preservation of traditional customs under indigenous leadership. But the stability of this system depended entirely on the continued goodwill of rulers in both Rome and Britain, and by the late 50s CE, that goodwill was beginning to erode. The new procurator, Catus Decianus, had been appointed with a mandate to increase provincial revenues, and he viewed the wealthy client kingdoms not as useful allies but as undertaxed resources waiting to be more fully exploited. Meanwhile, military commanders like Suetonius Paulinus focused on extending Roman control into Wales and eliminating the Druids who provided spiritual leadership to anti-Roman resistance, paid little attention to maintaining the delicate relationships that kept the eastern tribes peaceful. When Prasutagus died around 60 CE, he left behind a will that attempted to preserve his family's position through compromise, bequeathing half his wealth to the Roman emperor while leaving the remainder to his daughters under Boudica's regency. The arrangement reflected the same pragmatic approach that had characterized his entire reign, seeking to satisfy Roman expectations while maintaining some independence for his family and people. But pragmatism and compromise were luxuries that the Roman administration was no longer willing to indulge. Catus Decianus, viewing Prasutagus' death as an opportunity to eliminate the last vestiges of Iceni independence, declared the entire kingdom forfeit to Rome. Iceni nobles who protested this interpretation were enslaved, their lands confiscated and distributed to Roman veterans. The royal household itself was not spared from this systematic humiliation. Boudica was stripped and publicly flogged like a common criminal, while her daughters were sexually assaulted by Roman soldiers as their mother was forced to watch. The assault on the royal family was intended as a demonstration of Roman power, a clear message to any Britons who might question the empire's authority that even the highest-born natives were subject to Roman justice. But the procurator had fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of Celtic kingship and the character of the woman he had chosen to humiliate. Rather than breaking Boudica's spirit or intimidating her subjects into submission, the public degradation of their queen unleashed forces that had been building beneath the surface of Romano-British society for nearly 2 decades. Boudica's response was not the desperate lashing out of a humiliated individual, but the carefully orchestrated mobilization of tribal networks that had been waiting for exactly such a provocation. The Queen understood that her personal suffering, however agonizing, was merely the visible symbol of deeper grievances that extended throughout British society. Roman taxation had grown increasingly burdensome. Roman merchants had used their privileged legal status to exploit native traders, and Roman veterans had been granted land that displaced entire communities from territories their ancestors had farmed for generations. Most importantly, Boudica recognized that the Roman military forces in Britain were dangerously overextended. Suetonius Paulinus had taken the bulk of his legions into Wales for his campaign against the Druids on Anglesey, leaving the prosperous settlements of southeastern Britain defended by only auxiliary troops and local militias. The timing was perfect for a coordinated uprising that could eliminate the Roman presence before reinforcements could arrive from the continent. The Queen's first target was Camulodunum, the former Catuvellauni capital that had been transformed into a showcase of Roman civilization. Here, Roman veterans had been granted substantial estates carved from confiscated tribal lands, while a massive temple dedicated to the deified Emperor Claudius served as both a symbol of imperial power and a constant reminder of British subjugation. The town's defences were minimal, designed more for show than for serious military purposes, and its population was dominated by Romans and Romanized Britons who had little experience of warfare. When Boudica's forces appeared outside Camulodunum in early 60 CE, they brought with them not only warriors from the ICENI, but also fighters from the Trinovantes and other tribes whose grievances against Roman rule had been accumulating for decades. The army that assembled outside the town's walls represented the largest unified British force seen since the initial Roman invasion, and its composition sent a clear message that this was no localized rebellion, but a coordinated attempt to expel Roman authority from Britain entirely. The siege of Camulodunum was brief and merciless. The town's defenders, caught completely off guard by the scale and coordination of the British attack, managed to hold out for only 2 days before their defences were overwhelmed. What followed was not merely military conquest, but systematic extermination designed to eliminate every trace of Roman presence in the region. Men, women, and children were slaughtered without distinction, their bodies piled in the streets while British warriors systematically destroyed every building that represented Roman authority or culture. The Temple of Claudius, with its towering columns and magnificent statue of the emperor, received special attention from the vengeful Britons. The building was stripped of its treasures, its priestly staff massacred, and its structure razed so thoroughly that later archaeologists would struggle to determine its exact location. The destruction was not random vandalism, but calculated elimination of the symbols that had reminded the Britons daily of their subjugation. From Camulodunum, Boudica's army moved southeast toward Londinium, the thriving commercial centre that had grown up around the Roman bridge across the Thames. Unlike Camulodunum, which had been primarily an administrative and religious centre, Londinium was the economic heart of Roman Britain, where merchants from across the empire gathered to trade in British goods like tin, lead, and slaves. Its destruction would not only eliminate thousands of Romans, but also shatter the commercial networks that made the province profitable for the empire. The approach to Londinium revealed the true scale of British anger that Boudica had managed to harness and direct. Her army had grown to perhaps 100,000 warriors as tribes throughout southeastern Britain abandoned their traditional rivalries to join what they saw as a war of liberation. The force that descended on Londinium included not only battle-hardened warriors, but also women, children, and elderly people who had come to witness the destruction of the city that symbolized their oppression. Suetonius Paulinus, racing back from Wales with what forces he could muster, arrived at Londinium just ahead of the British army. His assessment of the situation was brutally realistic. The town was indefensible, its population too large to evacuate successfully, and his own forces too small to offer meaningful resistance. In one of the most controversial decisions of his career, the Roman commander chose to abandon Londinium to its fate rather than sacrifice his legions in a hopeless battle. The massacre that followed exceeded even the carnage at Camulodunum in its scope and savagery. British warriors, intoxicated by their easy victories and inflamed by decades of accumulated grievances, showed no mercy to any person or structure associated with Roman rule. The commercial districts were stripped of their wealth before being burned. The residential areas became killing grounds where terrified civilians were hunted through streets that ran red with blood, and the administrative buildings were demolished with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized the destruction of Camulodunum. Archaeological evidence suggests that the fire that consumed Londinium burned for days, creating a layer of ash and debris that would remain visible in the soil for nearly 2 millennia. The heat was so intense that it melted coins and jewelry, creating twisted lumps of metal that testified to the completeness of the destruction. But more chilling than the physical evidence of the fire was the discovery of human remains that revealed the fate of those who failed to escape before Boudica's warriors arrived. The British treatment of captured Romans reflected not only their anger, but also their desire to reverse the power relationships that had defined the province since the conquest. Roman women, accustomed to lives of relative privilege and security, were subjected to tortures that mirrored and magnified the humiliations that British women had endured under Roman rule. Roman merchants who had grown wealthy by exploiting native traders found themselves dying slowly while their former victims reclaimed the goods that had been taken from them. From Londinium, the British army moved north toward Verulamium, a tribal capital that had been rebuilt as a Roman municipality and populated largely by Britons who had embraced Roman culture and citizenship. The choice of target revealed the sophistication of Boudica's political thinking. By destroying a town populated primarily by collaborators rather than Romans, she was sending a clear message about the fate awaiting any Britons who continued to support the occupation. The destruction of Verulamium completed a triangle of devastation that eliminated the 3 most important Roman settlements in southeastern Britain and killed an estimated 70,000 people, most of them civilians, who had committed no crime beyond the accident of their birth or the choice of their residence. The scale of the killing was unprecedented in British history, transforming a regional rebellion into something approaching genocide. But Boudica's very success in mobilizing British anger and directing it against Roman targets contained the seeds of her ultimate defeat. The massacres at Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium had eliminated the possibility of any negotiated settlement with Rome, while giving Suetonius Paulinus the time he needed to concentrate his scattered forces and choose the ground for a decisive battle. The British army, swollen with non-combatants and slowed by the wagons full of loot taken from the destroyed cities, had become too large and unwieldy for the guerrilla tactics that might have allowed them to avoid a direct confrontation with the legions. The final battle, fought somewhere along Watling Street in late 60 or early 61 CE, pitted Boudica's massive but poorly organized force against approximately 10,000 Roman legionaries supported by auxiliary troops. The outcome was determined not by numbers, but by discipline, training, and tactical superiority that reflected centuries of military evolution. The British warriors, confident after their easy victories over undefended towns, found themselves facing soldiers who had been trained specifically to counter the Celtic charge that had terrified Roman armies since the time of the Gallic Wars. The slaughter was complete and terrible. British warriors, who had shown no mercy to Roman civilians, discovered that legionaries, operating under military discipline, were far more efficient killers than angry tribesmen driven by passion and revenge. When the battle ended, Boudica's army had ceased to exist as an organized force, while Roman casualties were so light that Suetonius could immediately begin planning the systematic pacification of the rebellious tribes. Boudica herself died either during the battle or shortly afterward, possibly by her own hand, to avoid capture and the humiliating parade through Rome that would have been her fate as a captured enemy commander. Her death marked the end not only of the greatest threat to Roman rule in Britain, but also of the last serious attempt by the Celtic tribes to regain their independence through unified military action. The rebellion's aftermath revealed both the strengths and limitations of the Roman approach to provincial governance. Suetonius Paulinus, his authority reinforced by military victory, began a campaign of repression designed to ensure that no future Boudica could emerge to threaten Roman control. Entire tribes suspected of supporting the rebellion were subjected to systematic punishment, their warriors killed, their women and children enslaved, and their lands confiscated for distribution to Roman veterans. But the scale of the initial uprising had also demonstrated the dangers of the exploitative policies that had provoked it. When a new procurator, Julius Classicianus, arrived to replace the discredited Catus Decianus, he brought with him instructions from Rome to adopt more conciliatory policies toward the surviving British population. The brutal extraction of wealth that had characterized the early years of the province was replaced by more sustainable methods of taxation. While efforts were made to incorporate British elites into the Roman administrative system, rather than simply replacing them with Italian appointees, Boudica's legacy thus encompassed both the immediate destruction she had wrought and the longer-term changes her rebellion had forced upon Roman policy. Her name would be remembered not only by her own people, but by Roman historians who struggled to understand how a barbarian woman had come so close to driving the legions from Britain. The memory of her revolt would influence Roman thinking about provincial administration for generations, serving as a reminder that even the most successful conquests could be undone by rulers who mistook military superiority for permanent dominance. ZETIAN. In the perfumed chambers of the Tang imperial palace, where silk curtains filtered the morning light and the rustle of courtiers' robes provided a constant whisper of ambition, a concubine named Wu Zhao was learning the deadly grammar of power that would eventually make her the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. Her ascent from the secondary ranks of the imperial harem to absolute dominion over the Middle Kingdom would be paved with corpses that included her own daughter, rival concubines, ministers who opposed her, and thousands of officials whose only crime was failing to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for female rule. The Tang dynasty of the 7th century represented the pinnacle of Chinese civilization, a cosmopolitan empire that stretched from Korea to Central Asia and drew merchants, diplomats, and scholars from across the known world to its glittering capital at Chang'an. Into this world of unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement, Wu Zhao was born around 624 CE, the daughter of a timber merchant who had supported Li Yuan's successful rebellion against the previous Sui dynasty. Her family's early loyalty to the Tang cause had earned them wealth and status, but it was Wu Zhao's exceptional beauty and intelligence that brought her to the attention of Emperor Taizong's talent scouts. Entering the imperial palace as a low-ranking concubine at the age of 14, Wu Zhao found herself in a world where hundreds of women competed for the attention of a single man, where favor could elevate a peasant girl to heights of luxury and influence, while disfavor could condemn an empress to obscurity or death. The harem was a complex ecosystem governed by its own laws and hierarchies, where survival required not only physical beauty, but political acumen, cultural sophistication, and above all, the ability to eliminate rivals without leaving fingerprints. Wu Zhao's initial position in Emperor Taizong's harem was unremarkable, her title of talented person placing her in the 5th rank of imperial consorts, far below the empress and the favored concubines who bore the emperor's children and influenced policy decisions. But she possessed advantages that her competitors lacked: literacy in an age when many women could not read, a quick intelligence that allowed her to master the complex protocols of court life, and most importantly, a willingness to employ any methods necessary to advance her position. The young concubine's opportunity came with Taizong's death in 649 CE and the accession of his son as Emperor Gaozong. According to imperial tradition, the deceased emperor's concubines, who had not borne male heirs, were expected to retire to Buddhist convents, spending their remaining years in religious contemplation and prayer for their master's soul. But Wu Zhao had already begun cultivating a relationship with the crown prince during his father's final illness, and when Gaozong became emperor, she alone, among Taizong's concubines, was recalled from the convent to serve in the new imperial harem. The transition from one emperor's concubine to another's represented both an unprecedented violation of Confucian morality and a demonstration of Wu Zhao's growing political sophistication. By positioning herself as Gaozong's ally against the established courtiers who had served his father, she transformed what should have been a liability her previous relationship with the old Emperor into an asset that set her apart from other women competing for the new ruler's attention. Wu Zhao's rise through the ranks of Gaozong's harem was methodical and ruthless. Within 5 years of her return from the convent, she had borne the emperor 2 sons and positioned herself as his most trusted advisor on matters ranging from military strategy to personnel appointments. But her ultimate objective, displacement of Empress Wang and assumption of the primary consort's position, required more than imperial favor. It demanded the systematic destruction of everyone who stood between her and the throne. The elimination of Empress Wang and consort Xiao, Gaozong's former favorite, represented Wu Zhao's masterpiece of political manipulation and calculated violence. Unable to attack her rivals directly without appearing to overstep her position, she instead orchestrated a campaign of whispered accusations and manufactured evidence that gradually convinced the emperor that his wife and former lover were plotting against him. The process took years to complete, requiring patience, perfect timing, and a willingness to sacrifice even her own family members to achieve her objectives. The most chilling episode in this campaign was Wu Zhao's murder of her own infant daughter and the subsequent framing of Empress Wang for the crime. When the baby was found dead in her cradle, Wu Zhao's grief appeared so genuine and her accusations against the empress so convincing that Gaozong ordered an investigation that revealed circumstantial evidence carefully planted by the future empress's supporters. The death of an innocent child, killed by her own mother to provide ammunition against a political rival, demonstrated both the depths of Wu Zhao's ambition and her complete absence of conventional maternal feeling. With Empress Wang and consort Xiao convicted of murdering the imperial infant, Wu Zhao had cleared the path for her own elevation to empress consort in 655 CE. But even this triumph was not enough to satisfy her appetite for power. The deposed empress and consort, initially spared execution in consideration of their former status, were secretly tortured to death on Wu Zhao's orders, their bodies mutilated and thrown into unmarked graves to prevent them from becoming focal points for opposition to the new empress. As Empress Wu, she began the systematic transformation of the Tang court from a Confucian meritocracy into a surveillance state, where loyalty to her person took precedence over traditional virtues like filial piety and scholarly achievement. She established networks of informants that penetrated every level of government, from provincial governors to palace servants, while creating new institutions like the secret police force known as the cruel officials that operated outside normal legal constraints. The empress's methods of dealing with suspected disloyalty became legendary for their creativity and savagery. Officials who questioned her policies might find themselves accused of treason based on dreams reported by professional informants, while their families faced collective punishment that could include execution, enslavement, or exile to distant frontier regions. The traditional Chinese emphasis on written records and bureaucratic procedure became weapons in Wu Zetian's hands, as she used the empire's own administrative machinery to document and justify the destruction of anyone who opposed her. When Emperor Gaozong suffered a stroke in 660 CE that left him partially paralyzed and increasingly dependent on his wife's assistance, Wu Zetian effectively became the sole ruler of China, while maintaining the fiction that she was merely helping her husband fulfill his imperial duties. This arrangement allowed her to exercise absolute power while avoiding the constitutional crisis that would have resulted from formal female rule, but it also created new challenges as ambitious ministers and members of the imperial family began plotting to exploit the emperor's weakness. The empress's response to these challenges was characteristically decisive and brutal. Prince Li Zhong, Gaozong's son by a previous consort, and therefore a potential threat to Wu Zetian's own children's succession prospects, was stripped of his titles and forced to commit suicide on fabricated charges of rebellion. Similar fates befell other members of the imperial family who showed insufficient enthusiasm for the empress's growing authority, including generals who had served the dynasty faithfully for decades but made the mistake of questioning female leadership. But Wu Zetian's most audacious move came after Gaozong's death in 683 CE, when she systematically eliminated her own sons to clear her path to direct rule. Emperor Zhongzong, who succeeded his father, lasted only 6 weeks before being deposed and exiled for showing too much independence from his mother's guidance. His replacement, Emperor Ruizong, proved more malleable, but was eventually forced to abdicate in favor of Wu Zetian herself, who assumed the throne in 690 CE as emperor of the newly proclaimed Zhou dynasty. The transformation from Empress Dowager to emperor required Wu Zetian to abandon even the pretense of traditional Chinese governance and establish entirely new precedents for female rule. She commissioned scholars to develop ideological justifications for her unprecedented position, drawing on Buddhist concepts of the universal monarch and Taoist principles of cosmic balance to argue that imperial authority transcended conventional gender distinctions. Meanwhile, her secret police continued their work of identifying and eliminating potential opposition with methodical efficiency. The scale of Wu Zetian's purges during her 15-year reign as emperor is difficult to calculate precisely, but contemporary sources suggest that over 12,000 officials were executed, exiled, or forced to commit suicide for various forms of disloyalty. Entire bureaucratic departments were repeatedly purged and reconstituted with new personnel, while provincial administrations were subjected to constant surveillance and irregular inspections designed to detect the earliest signs of resistance to female rule. Yet, for all its brutality, Wu Zetian's reign was also marked by significant achievements that demonstrated her genuine capabilities as a ruler. She expanded the imperial examination system to recruit talented officials regardless of their family backgrounds, promoted religious tolerance that allowed Buddhism and Taoism to flourish alongside Confucianism, and maintained the territorial integrity of the Tang Empire against external threats from Tibet and the Turkish Khaganates. Her economic policies promoted trade and agricultural development, while her patronage of arts and literature contributed to what many historians consider the golden age of Chinese culture. The contradiction between Wu Zetian's administrative competence and her murderous methods reflects the fundamental paradox of absolute monarchy. The same ruthlessness that enabled her to seize and maintain power also made her an effective ruler, capable of making difficult decisions without being constrained by traditional limitations. Her willingness to execute thousands of officials for suspected disloyalty created a climate of fear that ensured obedience, while her promotion of merit over birth opened government service to talented individuals who might otherwise have been excluded from power. When Wu Zetian finally died in 705 CE, at the age of 81, she left behind an empire that was both more centralized and more prosperous than the one she had inherited, but also one that had been fundamentally transformed by nearly half a century of female rule. Her posthumous rehabilitation by Tang historians, who emphasized her achievements while downplaying her crimes, reflected the complex legacy of a ruler whose methods were monstrous, but whose results were often admirable. The empress's impact on Chinese political culture would endure long after her death, establishing precedents for strong central government and bureaucratic efficiency while demonstrating the dangers of unchecked imperial power. Her example would influence later Chinese rulers, both male and female, while her reign remained a subject of debate among scholars who struggled to reconcile her undeniable achievements with the massive human cost of her policies. Fredegund of Neustria. In the shadow-haunted halls of 6th century Francia, where the Merovingian dynasty ruled over a patchwork of kingdoms carved from the ruins of Roman Gaul, power flowed through bloodlines that were perpetually stained with fratricide and betrayal. Into this world of constant warfare and dynastic intrigue, a slave girl named Fredegund would rise to become one of history's most accomplished assassins, orchestrating murders with such systematic efficiency that even her fellow Frankish nobles, accustomed to casual violence as a tool of statecraft, would regard her methods with a mixture of admiration and horror. The Frankish kingdoms of the late 6th century represented a unique fusion of Germanic warrior culture and Roman administrative traditions, where kings, who claimed descent from the sea god, ruled over territories that stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. But unlike the centralized empires of Rome or Byzantium, Frankish power was fundamentally personal and familial, dependent on the complex web of relationships between royal families, noble clans, and warrior bands that owed allegiance to individual leaders rather than abstract institutions. Fredegund's origins were humble, even by the standards of an age when social mobility was primarily achieved through military service or royal favor. Born into slavery around 545 CE, probably in the region that would later become Belgium, she possessed no advantages of birth, education, or family connection that might have elevated her above the mass of unfree laborers who worked the great estates of Frankish nobles. What distinguished her from countless other slave women was not her circumstances, but her exceptional beauty, quick intelligence, and most importantly, her intuitive understanding of how power operated in a society where murder was often indistinguishable from politics. Her entrance into royal circles came through her service in the household of King Chilperic I of Neustria, one of the 4 kingdoms that had emerged from the division of the Frankish Empire among the grandsons of Clovis. Chilperic, like most Merovingian rulers, maintained multiple wives and concubines as both a mark of status and a practical necessity in a political system where marriage alliances were essential tools of diplomacy. Fredegund's elevation from slave to royal concubine represented a dramatic improvement in her circumstances, but it also placed her in direct competition with women whose family connections and political sophistication far exceeded her own. The young woman's first serious rival was Queen Galswintha, a Visigothic princess whose marriage to Chilperic had been arranged to strengthen the alliance between the Frankish kingdoms and the Visigothic kingdom of Spain. Galswintha brought with her not only substantial dowry payments, but also the diplomatic prestige that came from her royal bloodline and her connections to one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. For Fredegund, whose own influence depended entirely on Chilperic's personal favor, the queen represented an existential threat that could only be eliminated through direct action. The murder of Galswintha in 568 CE established both the pattern and the reputation that would characterize Fredegund's entire career. Rather than employing the crude methods favored by most Frankish assassin sword thrusts in dark corridors or poison, administered by clumsy servants, she orchestrated the queen's death with sophisticated planning that left no clear evidence of foul play. Galswintha was found strangled in her bed, apparently the victim of a botched robbery. Though the careful selection of missing items and the convenient absence of her usual guards suggested a more deliberate cause, the queen's death achieved Fredegund's immediate objective of eliminating her primary rival for Chilperic's affections. But it also triggered a broader conflict that would dominate Frankish politics for the next 4 decades. Galswintha's sister Brunhilda, queen of the neighboring kingdom of Austrasia, correctly identified Fredegund as her sister's murderer and swore the blood vengeance that Germanic law demanded for the killing of family members. What began as a personal feud between 2 queens would eventually engulf entire kingdoms in warfare and create a cycle of assassination and retaliation that decimated the Merovingian royal family. But Fredegund's ambitions extended far beyond the elimination of romantic rivals. Her marriage to Chilperic in 569 CE, formalized shortly after Galswintha's convenient death, provided her with the platform necessary to implement a broader campaign of murder, designed to secure her family's position at the apex of Frankish power. Unlike other royal women who relied primarily on their husband's authority and protection, Fredegund developed her own networks of agents and supporters, while maintaining direct control over the resources necessary to fund extended assassination campaigns. Her methods reflected both her humble origins and her sophisticated understanding of Frankish political culture. Rather than relying on the expensive services of professional killers or the uncertain loyalty of noble conspirators, she recruited her assassins from the ranks of slaves, freedmen, and social outcasts who had few options for advancement and everything to gain from royal patronage. These operatives, bound to her by ties of gratitude and mutual dependence, proved far more reliable than the aristocratic agents employed by her rivals. The systematic nature of Fredegund's assassination campaigns became apparent during her conflict with Sigebert I, Brunhilda's husband and King of Austrasia. Rather than limiting herself to defensive measures against Brunhilda's attempts at vengeance, Fredegund launched a preemptive strike designed to eliminate the entire Austrasian royal family. Her agents, operating under various covers as merchants, pilgrims, and diplomatic messengers, penetrated Sigebert's court with instructions to kill not only the king but also his children and principal supporters. The assassination of Sigebert in 575 CE demonstrated Fredegund's growing sophistication as a coordinator of political murder. The king was killed during a military campaign, struck down by assassins who had managed to infiltrate his army and position themselves close enough to his person to use poisoned weapons. The timing was perfect, eliminating Sigebert at the moment when his forces were positioned to threaten Neustria, while creating maximum chaos within the Austrasian command structure. But Fredegund's masterpiece of strategic assassination was her orchestration of Bishop Praetextatus's murder in 586 CE. The bishop, one of the most influential religious leaders in Frankish Gaul, had made the mistake of performing the marriage ceremony that united Brunhilda's daughter with a potential ally against Neustria. Rather than simply having the bishop killed, Fredegund arranged for his assassination to take place during Mass, in full view of his congregation, by killers who escaped in the confusion that followed their attack. The murder achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. It eliminated a powerful enemy, sent a clear message about the consequences of opposing Fredegund's interests, and demonstrated her ability to strike at targets who should have been protected by both their sacred status and their public visibility. The psychological impact on her remaining enemies was profound, creating a climate of fear that made other potential opponents reluctant to take action against her. Perhaps even more chilling was Fredegund's willingness to eliminate members of her own family when they threatened her political objectives. When her stepson Clovis, Chilperic's son by a previous marriage, began showing signs of independence and attracting support from nobles who preferred male leadership, she arranged for his murder, using methods that demonstrated both her creativity and her complete lack of maternal feeling. The young prince was killed by agents who had gained his confidence by posing as supporters of his claim to inherit his father's throne. The pattern was repeated with other potential rivals within the royal family, including bishops, noble supporters, and even servants who possessed inconvenient knowledge about her previous crimes. Fredegund's network of killers operated with such efficiency that contemporary chroniclers described a climate of constant fear within the Neustrian court, where courtiers went about their daily business, knowing that any word or action might be their last. Yet, for all her skill as an organizer of murder, Fredegund was also a competent ruler who maintained her kingdom's prosperity and territorial integrity during nearly 4 decades of constant warfare. Her administration of Neustria demonstrated the same attention to detail and long-term planning that characterized her assassination campaigns, while her military leadership during conflicts with rival kingdoms proved that her talents extended beyond the organization of covert operations. When Chilperic was assassinated in 584 CE, probably by agents working for Brunhilda in retaliation for her own losses, Fredegund faced the greatest challenge of her career: maintaining power as a queen dowager with only an infant son to legitimize her authority. Her response demonstrated both her political sophistication and her willingness to employ even more extreme methods when her survival was threatened. The regency that Fredegund established for her son Clothar II represented a new model of female rule in Frankish politics, one that dispensed with the traditional limitations imposed on queen mothers and established direct monarchical authority exercised through networks of personal loyalty rather than formal institutional structures. Her agents continued their work of eliminating potential threats, while she simultaneously built new alliances with noble families and religious leaders who recognized that their own survival might depend on her continued success. The final phase of Fredegund's career, lasting from 584 to her death in 597 CE, saw her transform from a serial assassin operating within existing political structures into something approaching a modern intelligence chief, coordinating networks of spies and killers that extended throughout Frankish Gaul and into neighboring kingdoms. Her innovations in covert operations and political surveillance would influence European statecraft for centuries, establishing precedents for the systematic use of murder as a tool of foreign policy. When Fredegund finally died in 597 CE, she left behind a kingdom that was both more centralized and more efficiently administered than the one she had inherited, but also one that had been fundamentally transformed by decades of systematic violence. Her son, Clothar II, would eventually reunite the Frankish kingdoms under his sole rule, achieving through inheritance and diplomacy the objectives that his mother had pursued through assassination and terror. Brunhilda of Austrasia. Across the contested borderlands that separated the Frankish kingdoms of Neustria and Austrasia, where ancient Roman roads still carried the traffic of merchants and armies through landscapes scarred by decades of warfare, another queen was perfecting her own methods of political murder in a blood feud that would consume two royal dynasties and transform the nature of Merovingian kingship. Brunhilda of Austrasia, a Visigothic princess whose marriage into the Frankish royal family was intended to strengthen diplomatic ties between Christian kingdoms, would instead become the architect of one of the most systematic campaigns of vengeance in European history. Born around 543 CE into the royal house of Visigothic Spain, Brunhilda had received the education befitting a princess destined for diplomatic marriage, fluency in Latin and Gothic, familiarity with both Arian and Catholic theology, and most importantly, training in the complex protocols that governed relationships between the Germanic kingdoms that had inherited the Western Roman Empire. Her marriage to King Sigebert I of Austrasia in 566 CE represented the culmination of negotiations designed to create a Christian alliance capable of resisting both Lombard expansion in Italy and Byzantine attempts to recover lost territories in Gaul. The young queen's initial years in Austrasia were marked by the same careful cultivation of influence and alliance building that characterized successful royal women throughout the early medieval period. She bore Sigebert a daughter, Ingund, whose existence secured the dynastic succession while providing Brunhilda with the legitimacy that came from producing heirs to the throne. More importantly, she demonstrated the political acumen that would later make her one of the most effective rulers of her generation, mastering the complex relationships between Austrasian noble families while maintaining the diplomatic connections that linked her adopted kingdom to the broader world of European politics. But Brunhilda's transformation from diplomatic princess to master assassin began with a single act of violence that would define the remainder of her life: the murder of her sister Galswintha by Fredegund in 568 CE. The killing represented not only a personal loss, but a direct challenge to Brunhilda's honor and status as a member of the Visigothic royal family. According to the Germanic codes of blood vengeance that still governed inter-family relationships among the Frankish nobility, she was obligated to seek retribution for her sister's death, regardless of the political consequences such action might entail. Brunhilda's initial response to Galswintha's murder demonstrated both her strategic thinking and her understanding that effective vengeance required patience and careful preparation. Rather than launching an immediate attack against Fredegund, she spent years building the military and political alliances necessary to wage sustained warfare against Neustria, while simultaneously developing the networks of agents and informants that would allow her to strike at her enemies through covert operations as well as open battle. The Queen's first major success came in 575 CE, with the elimination of several key supporters of Chilperic and Fredegund, including nobles whose deaths were arranged to appear accidental or the result of personal feuds rather than political assassination. These early murders demonstrated Brunhilda's growing sophistication in the arts of covert warfare, while establishing the reputation for ruthless efficiency that would make her feared throughout the Frankish kingdoms. But it was the assassination of King Chilperic himself in 584 CE that marked Brunhilda's emergence as one of Europe's most dangerous rulers. The murder, carried out by agents who had infiltrated the Neustrian court over a period of months, was timed to coincide with Chilperic's return from a hunting expedition, when his normal security arrangements would be relaxed and his location predictable. The killing was accomplished with such professional skill that even Fredegund, despite her own expertise in political murder, was unable to identify the specific perpetrators or gather evidence sufficient to justify retaliation. Chilperic's death achieved multiple objectives that demonstrated Brunhilda's growing mastery of strategic assassination. It eliminated the primary source of military and political support for Fredegund, while creating a succession crisis in Neustria that prevented immediate retaliation. Most importantly, it avenged Galswinther's murder, while positioning Brunhilda as the dominant figure in Frankish politics, capable of striking at enemies regardless of their apparent security or political protection. The period following Chilperic's assassination saw Brunhilda expand her operations beyond simple revenge killings to encompass a broader campaign of political consolidation designed to eliminate all potential threats to her growing power. Her targets included not only obvious enemies like supporters of Fredegund, but also members of her own court who showed insufficient enthusiasm for her leadership or displayed the kind of independence that might eventually challenge her authority. The Queen's methods reflected both her aristocratic background and her sophisticated understanding of how power operated in Frankish society. Unlike Fredegund, who relied primarily on agents recruited from the lower classes, Brunhilda built her assassination networks around disaffected nobles and ambitious clerics who possessed both the social standing necessary to approach high-value targets and the political sophistication required to plan complex operations. These collaborators, bound to her by ties of mutual interest and shared culpability, proved capable of eliminating enemies with a subtlety and efficiency that matched her own strategic vision. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Brunhilda's career was her ability to maintain her assassination campaigns across multiple generations of rulers, adapting her methods and objectives to meet the changing political circumstances that accompanied dynastic transitions and territorial reorganizations. When her husband Sigebert died in 575 CE, she successfully established a regency for their young son Childebert II, while continuing her covert operations against Neustrian targets. When Childebert reached maturity and began asserting his own authority, she modified her role from regent to advisor while retaining control over the intelligence networks that had made her assassination campaigns possible. The Queen's treatment of potential rivals within her own family demonstrated the same ruthless pragmatism that characterized her approach to external enemies. When Childebert's growing independence threatened to limit her influence, she arranged for his death through poison administered by agents who had gained access to the royal household. The murder was accomplished with such skill that even contemporary chroniclers, accustomed to recording royal deaths under suspicious circumstances, described the king's demise as the result of natural illness. Childebert's death in 596 CE allowed Brunhilda to establish a new regency for his young sons, Theodoric II and Theodebert II, while continuing her decades-long campaign against the surviving members of Fredegund's family and their supporters. The queen's ability to maintain power across 3 generations of rulers reflected not only her political skill but also her systematic elimination of anyone who might have challenged her authority or provided alternative leadership. For the Austrasian kingdom. But Brunhilda's most audacious murders were reserved for those who dared to question her methods or attempt to limit her authority. When Bishop Desiderius of Vienne criticized her relationship with her grandson Theodoric II and suggested that the queen's influence over the young king was inappropriate, she arranged for his assassination with characteristic efficiency. The bishop was killed by a mob that had been carefully organized to appear spontaneous, while the timing of his death prevented any investigation that might have revealed the orchestrated nature of the attack. The systematic nature of Brunhilda's assassination campaigns became even more apparent during the final phase of her career, when she used her grandson's rivalry to eliminate potential threats while maintaining her own position as the power behind both thrones. When Theudebert II began showing signs of independence from his grandmother's guidance, she encouraged Theodoric II to wage war against his brother, while providing intelligence and logistical support that ensured Theudebert's eventual defeat and death. The elimination of Theudebert in 612 CE left Brunhilda with only one surviving grandson, but it also demonstrated the ultimate futility of her strategy of maintaining power through systematic murder. Theodoric II, traumatized by his role in his brother's death and increasingly resentful of his grandmother's manipulation, began planning his own escape from her control. When he died suddenly in 613 CE, possibly from illness but more likely from poison, administered by agents seeking to prevent his planned rebellion, Brunhilda found herself ruling on behalf of his infant son, the last surviving male heir of the Austrasian royal line. The queen's final downfall came not from any failure in her assassination techniques, but from the simple exhaustion of targets and allies that inevitably results from decades of systematic murder. By 613 CE, she had eliminated so many potential supporters and created so many enemies that her position had become fundamentally unsustainable. When Clothar II of Neustria, Fredegund's son, invaded Austrasia, with the support of Austrasian nobles who had grown tired of Brunhilda's rule, he found little organized resistance to his advance. Brunhilda's capture and execution in 613 CE marked the end of the most successful career in political assassination achieved by any European ruler of the early medieval period, but it also represented the logical conclusion of a strategy that contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. Her death, accomplished through the grotesque method of being tied to wild horses and torn apart, reflected both the horror that her methods had inspired among her enemies and the determination of her captors to ensure that she could never again threaten the stability of the Frankish kingdoms. The final irony of Brunhilda's career lay in its ultimate futility. Despite nearly 5 decades of systematic murder and political manipulation, she failed to achieve her primary objective of securing her dynasty's permanent dominance over the Frankish kingdoms. Her assassination campaigns had eliminated countless enemies and rivals, but they had also created the conditions for the violent reaction that would eventually consume both her and the last vestiges of Austrasian independence. Yet Brunhilda's legacy extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of her actions. Her innovations in covert operations and political surveillance established precedents that would influence European statecraft for centuries, while her example demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of female rule in societies that remained fundamentally patriarchal, despite their occasional tolerance for exceptional women who possessed the skills necessary to navigate and manipulate existing power structures. Irene of Byzantium. In the marble-columned halls of the Great Palace of Constantinople, where the sacred and secular authorities of the Eastern Roman Empire converged in ceremonies that claimed to mirror the heavenly court itself, a young woman from Athens was learning that the path to absolute power sometimes required the most absolute betrayals. Irene of Athens, who would become the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own name, would achieve that unprecedented distinction through an act of maternal violence so shocking that even the court chroniclers, accustomed to recording the casual brutalities of imperial politics, struggled to find adequate language for her crime. The Byzantine Empire of the 8th century represented the last continuous link to the classical world, a state that maintained the forms and pretensions of Rome while adapting its institutions to meet the challenges of a medieval world dominated by rising Islamic powers and emerging barbarian kingdoms. Into this world of complex theology and elaborate court ritual, Irene was born around 752 CE, daughter of a noble Athenian family whose wealth and status derived from their successful navigation of the empire's intricate administrative hierarchies. Irene's path to imperial power began with her marriage to Leo IV in 769 CE, a union that represented the culmination of careful negotiations between the Isaurian dynasty and the powerful families of Constantinople's urban aristocracy. Leo, son of the iconoclast Emperor Constantine V, brought to the marriage not only his position as heir to the imperial throne, but also his commitment to the religious policies that had made his family both powerful and controversial throughout the Christian world. The iconoclast controversy that dominated Byzantine politics during this period represented far more than a simple theological dispute about the proper role of religious images in Christian worship. The question of whether icons should be venerated or destroyed had become entangled with broader issues of imperial authority, monastic privilege, and the empire's relationship with both the papacy and the Islamic powers that controlled much of the former Byzantine territory in the east. Irene's own position on these matters would prove crucial to her eventual rise to power, but it would also create the conflicts that made her most terrible crime seem politically necessary. When Leo IV died unexpectedly in 780 CE, leaving behind a 10-year-old son named Constantine VI, Irene found herself in the familiar but precarious position of a Byzantine empress mother charged with protecting her child's inheritance against the ambitions of rival claimants and powerful court factions. Her initial response to this challenge demonstrated both her political sophistication and her understanding that survival in Byzantine politics required not only defensive measures, but the systematic elimination of potential threats to her family's position. The Empress Mother's first targets were the powerful military commanders and court officials who had supported her husband's iconoclast policies while expressing reservations about female regency. These men, veterans of the empire's ongoing wars against the Arabs and Bulgars, possessed both the military experience and the political connections necessary to challenge Irene's authority or attempt to establish their own control over the young emperor. Their systematic elimination, accomplished through a combination of forced retirement, exile, and carefully orchestrated accidents, demonstrated Irene's growing mastery of Byzantine court intrigue. But Irene's most significant innovation during her early years as regent was her decision to reverse the iconoclast policies that had defined imperial religious policy for more than half a century. This dramatic shift, formalized at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 CE, represented both a genuine theological conviction on her part and a calculated political strategy designed to build new sources of support among the monastic communities and icon-venerating populations that had suffered under previous iconoclast emperors. The restoration of icon veneration achieved multiple objectives that demonstrated Irene's sophisticated understanding of Byzantine political dynamics. It eliminated the religious opposition that had constrained her authority, while providing her with a new ideological framework that could justify female rule in terms of divine favor and religious orthodoxy. Most importantly, it created a powerful constituency of monks, nuns, and ordinary believers whose continued support would depend on her maintenance of the policies they favored. Yet Irene's religious innovations also created new sources of conflict. particularly with the military aristocracy that had benefited from iconoclast policies, and viewed the restoration of monasticism as a threat to the empire's military effectiveness. These tensions came to a head as Constantine VI approached majority and began expressing his own views about both religious policy and the appropriate limits of his mother's continuing authority. The growing conflict between mother and son reflected fundamental disagreements about both the substance of imperial policy and the proper relationship between regent and emperor. Constantine VI, influenced by military advisors who resented Irene's religious policies and court officials who believed that her continued dominance was undermining imperial authority, began asserting his independence in ways that threatened the political coalition she had spent years constructing. Irene's response to her son's growing independence was initially defensive, focusing on the replacement of his advisors with officials more sympathetic to her policies, while attempting to limit his access to the military commanders who might support an attempt to establish genuine imperial authority. But these measures proved inadequate to address the fundamental problem. As long as Constantine VI remained alive and capable of ruling, Irene's own power would inevitably be constrained by the expectations of those who believed that male rule was both more legitimate and more effective than female regency. The crisis that would ultimately lead to Irene's most terrible crime began in 797 CE, when Constantine VI attempted to assert his authority by dismissing several of his mother's key supporters and appointing military commanders who had expressed opposition to her religious policies. The emperor's actions, while constitutionally legitimate, threatened to undo everything that Irene had accomplished during nearly 2 decades of careful political maneuvering and religious reform. Irene's response revealed both the depths of her ambition and her complete willingness to sacrifice even the most fundamental bonds of family loyalty to maintain her grip on power. Rather than accepting the constitutional reality of her son's majority, or seeking some compromise that might have preserved her influence while acknowledging his authority, she chose the most extreme solution available: the physical elimination of the emperor himself. The plot to blind Constantine VI was orchestrated with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized Irene's previous political operations, but it required a level of personal betrayal that shocked even the Byzantine court, where family murder was a familiar tool of imperial politics. The empress mother used her continued access to the palace and her knowledge of her son's daily routines to identify the perfect moment for the attack, while recruiting agents whose loyalty to her outweighed any qualms they might have had about assaulting the sacred person of the emperor. On July 15, 797 CE, Constantine VI was seized by his mother's agents while walking in the palace gardens, dragged to the purple chamber where he had been born 27 years earlier, and subjected to the horrific punishment that would ensure his permanent removal from imperial politics. The blinding was accomplished using red-hot irons applied directly to his eyes, a method that guaranteed not only his inability to rule but also his compliance with Byzantine law, which prohibited physically imperfect individuals from holding imperial office. The immediate aftermath of Constantine's blinding demonstrated both the effectiveness of Irene's planning and the fundamental isolation that her methods had created. The emperor's screams, audible throughout the palace complex, announced to courtiers and servants alike that a new phase of imperial history had begun, one in which maternal authority would no longer be constrained by the traditional expectations of male succession. Yet, the very brutality of the act also created new sources of opposition among those who viewed it as a violation of both natural law and divine order. Irene's assumption of sole imperial authority in 797 CE marked the first time in Byzantine history that a woman had ruled the empire in her own name rather than as regent for a male heir. This unprecedented situation required her to develop new forms of legitimacy and new methods of governance that could function without the traditional foundations of imperial authority. Her solution was to present herself as God's chosen instrument for the restoration of Orthodox Christianity, while maintaining the networks of surveillance and intimidation that had made her rise to power possible. The Empress's religious policies during her 5-year reign as sole ruler represented the culmination of her efforts to transform Byzantine Christianity from an iconoclast church that emphasized imperial authority over religious images into an icon-venerating institution that acknowledged the independent spiritual authority of monks and other religious figures. Her patronage of monasteries and her restoration of confiscated church properties helped consolidate the support of religious communities that had suffered under previous iconoclast emperors, while her theological innovations provided a framework for female rule that drew on Christian traditions of female sanctity and spiritual authority. Yet Irene's reign also demonstrated the practical limitations of power, built primarily on religious legitimacy and systematic intimidation. Her military commanders, many of whom had accepted her authority only reluctantly after Constantine's blinding, proved increasingly unreliable when faced with external threats from the Arab Caliphate and the emerging Bulgarian kingdom. Her fiscal policies, designed to fund both her religious patronage and her extensive surveillance operations, created economic pressures that alienated the commercial classes whose support was essential for the empire's continued prosperity. Most problematically, Irene's elimination of Constantine VI had created a succession crisis that would inevitably threaten the stability of the empire. With no legitimate male heir and no established precedent for female succession, her death would almost certainly trigger a period of civil war between competing claimants to the imperial throne. This fundamental vulnerability made her position increasingly precarious as she aged and as potential rivals began calculating the risks and benefits of challenging her authority. The Empress's attempts to address the succession problem through diplomatic marriage negotiations revealed both her continued political sophistication and the constraints that her previous actions had created. Her overtures to Charlemagne, who had recently been crowned emperor by the Pope and was seeking to legitimize his authority through marriage alliance with the Byzantine imperial family, offered the possibility of creating a unified Christian empire spanning both East and West. Yet these negotiations also demonstrated her isolation from the Byzantine political establishment, whose members viewed any Western marriage as a betrayal of the empire's Roman heritage and Orthodox Christian identity. Irene's downfall in 802 CE came not through military defeat or popular uprising, but through a palace coup organized by the finance minister Nikephoros, who had concluded that the empire's continued survival required a return to more traditional forms of imperial authority. The coup succeeded largely because Irene's elimination of potential rivals and her reliance on intimidation rather than genuine loyalty had left her without reliable supporters willing to risk their lives to defend her position. The deposed empress's exile to the island of Lesbos marked the end of the most remarkable career achieved by any woman in Byzantine history, but it also represented the restoration of traditional imperial institutions that would constrain female political participation for centuries to come. Her death in 803 CE, officially from natural causes but possibly from poison, administered by agents seeking to prevent any attempt at restoration, eliminated the last direct link to the iconoclast controversy, while clearing the way for new forms of imperial authority that would characterize the Byzantine Empire's medieval phase. Irene's legacy encompassed both her unprecedented achievement of sole female rule and the terrible methods she had employed to secure and maintain that position. Her blinding of Constantine VI remained the most shocking example of maternal violence in Byzantine history, while her religious policies established precedents for imperial patronage of monasticism that would influence the empire's spiritual development for centuries. Yet her ultimate failure to establish a stable succession or create lasting institutions capable of supporting female rule demonstrated the limitations of power built primarily on elimination of rivals and systematic intimidation. The historical assessment of Irene's reign would remain controversial long after her death, with religious chroniclers emphasizing her role in restoring icon veneration, while secular historians focused on the political and military failures that had weakened the empire during her rule. But perhaps her most significant contribution to Byzantine political culture was her demonstration that even the most fundamental assumptions about gender and authority could be overturned by individuals willing to employ sufficient violence and possessing adequate political skill to survive the consequences of their actions. Olga of Kiev. In the vast forests and river valleys of 10th century Kievan Rus, where Slavic tribes had recently coalesced into principalities that controlled the great trade routes between Scandinavia and Byzantium, a princess named Olga was about to demonstrate that vengeance could be elevated to the level of high art when practiced with sufficient imagination and systematic planning. Her response to her husband's murder would unfold across several years in a series of escalating massacres that combined the theatrical flair of a master storyteller with the ruthless efficiency of a military commander, earning her a reputation for creative brutality that would endure long after her subsequent conversion to Christianity and eventual canonization as a saint. The political landscape of early Kievan Rus represented a complex fusion of Slavic agricultural settlements, Scandinavian warrior bands, and Byzantine commercial networks that had created a unique form of medieval state building along the river systems that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. Into this world of competing princes and shifting tribal alliances, Olga had married around 903 CE, becoming the wife of Igor I of Kiev, a ruler whose authority derived from his control of the lucrative trade routes that carried furs, amber, and slaves from the northern forests to the markets of Constantinople. The marriage between Olga and Igor represented more than a simple dynastic union. It was a strategic alliance between different elements of the emerging Rus political system, binding together Slavic agricultural communities and Scandinavian warrior elites through ties of kinship and mutual interest. Olga herself, despite later legendary accounts that emphasized her Slavic origins, was probably of mixed Scandinavian and Slavic ancestry, a background that would prove crucial to her ability to unite diverse tribal groups in support of her campaigns of vengeance. Igor's death in 945 CE, while collecting tribute from the Drevlian tribe in the forests southwest of Kiev, created the succession crisis that would define the remainder of Olga's life. The Drevlians, who had grudgingly accepted Kievan overlordship and the tributary obligations that accompanied it, had decided that Igor's demands for additional payments exceeded the bounds of traditional tribute relationships. Their murder of the prince, accomplished by tying him between two bent birch trees and allowing them to spring back to their natural positions, was intended as both an execution and a symbolic statement about the consequences of excessive greed. But the Drevlians' calculation that Igor's death would free them from Kievan domination failed to account for the character and capabilities of his widow. Rather than accepting the loss of her husband and the implied reduction in her son's inheritance, Olga chose to interpret the murder as a challenge to the entire political structure that had elevated her family to prominence. Her response would demonstrate not only her personal capacity for violence, but also her sophisticated understanding of how to use systematic terror as a tool of state building. The Drevlian embassy that arrived in Kiev shortly after Igor's death, ostensibly to negotiate peace terms, but actually to demand that Olga marry their Prince Mal and accept the incorporation of her territories into a Drevlian confederation, provided the princess with her first opportunity to demonstrate the fate awaiting those who had presumed to challenge her authority. Rather than rejecting their proposal outright or responding with conventional military threats, she received the ambassadors with apparent graciousness, while secretly preparing the elaborate revenge that would establish her reputation for creative brutality. Olga's first massacre was a masterpiece of theatrical planning that combined elements of traditional Slavic burial customs with innovations that reflected her own psychological sophistication. The Drevlian ambassadors, invited to repeat their marriage proposal during a formal ceremony, were told that they would be carried to the princess's presence in their boat as a mark of special honor. What they did not realize was that the pit that had been prepared to receive their vessel would become their grave, as Olga's soldiers buried them alive while they sat in their boat, creating a grotesque parody of the ship burials practiced by Scandinavian warriors. The second massacre, orchestrated just weeks after the first, demonstrated Olga's understanding that effective terror required not only creative methods, but also careful timing and presentation. When the Drevlians sent a second embassy to inquire about the fate of their missing ambassadors and to renew their marriage proposal, she welcomed them with similar courtesy, while secretly preparing another elaborate execution. This time, the visitors were invited to use the bathhouse that had been specially prepared for their comfort, only to discover too late that the building had been designed as a trap that could be set ablaze from the outside, burning them alive while they remained helplessly trapped within. But Olga's most ambitious act of vengeance was yet to come. Rather than simply continuing to eliminate Drevlian diplomatic missions, she announced her willingness to travel to Drevlian territory to personally commemorate her husband's death and discuss the terms of the political settlement that would follow her marriage to Prince Mal. The proposal appeared to represent a dramatic shift in her position, suggesting that the princess had finally accepted the reality of her situation and was prepared to negotiate from a position of weakness. The funeral feast that Olga organized in Drevlian territory for her deceased husband was planned as the culmination of her campaign of revenge, an event that would eliminate not just individual ambassadors, but the entire Drevlian political leadership in a single coordinated operation. The princess arrived with a large retinue that appeared to consist primarily of servants and mourners, though careful observers might have noticed that many of these attendants possessed the physical bearing and equipment of professional warriors. The massacre that unfolded during the funeral feast demonstrated both the scale of Olga's ambitions and her meticulous attention to detail in planning large-scale operations. As the Drevlian nobles became increasingly intoxicated with the mead and wine that she had provided in abundance, her disguised warriors moved systematically through the crowd, eliminating their targets with weapons that had been concealed among the funeral offerings. By the time the slaughter was complete, an estimated 5,000 Drevlian nobles, warriors, and community leaders lay dead, their bodies scattered among the remnants of what had been intended as a celebration of political reconciliation. Yet even this massive killing was merely the prelude to Olga's final and most spectacular act of vengeance. Rather than considering her campaign complete with the elimination of the Drevlian leadership, she proceeded to mount a systematic military campaign designed to destroy their entire political and economic structure. The siege of Iskorostan, the Drevlian capital, would demonstrate her most famous innovation in siege warfare and establish her reputation as one of the most creative military commanders of her generation. The siege itself lasted for months, as Olga's forces systematically isolated the city and eliminated any possibility of relief or resupply. But rather than attempting to break through the city's defenses through conventional assault or siege engines, she developed a psychological strategy that combined apparent mercy with devastating effectiveness. After months of blockade, she announced her willingness to accept a token tribute in exchange for lifting the siege, asking only for 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household in the city. The Drevlians, exhausted by months of siege and desperate for any resolution that would allow them to survive, eagerly provided the birds that Olga had requested, viewing her demands as evidence that she was finally prepared to show mercy. What they failed to understand was that the princess had transformed their tribute into the instrument of their destruction. Each bird was fitted with small pieces of sulfur and cloth that could be ignited, then released to return to their nests in the city's buildings. The conflagration that resulted from this ingenious use of incendiary birds was so complete and devastating that it entered the folklore of multiple cultures as an example of both military innovation and divine justice. Iskorostan burned so thoroughly that its exact location would be forgotten by later generations, while the few survivors of the fire provided gruesome testimony about the effectiveness of Olga's methods. The destruction of the Drevlian capital marked the end of their existence as an independent political entity and served as a warning to other tribes about the consequences of challenging Kievan authority. The immediate aftermath of Olga's campaign demonstrated both the effectiveness of her methods and their broader implications for the development of Kievan Rus as a unified state. The systematic elimination of Drevlian leadership and the destruction of their political infrastructure had created a power vacuum that could only be filled by direct Kievan administration, effectively incorporating their territory into a more centralized political system. The tribute that had previously been collected irregularly and with difficulty could now be gathered systematically by officials who answered directly to Kiev. But perhaps more importantly, Olga's campaign had established new precedents for the use of terror as a tool of state building and political consolidation. The creative brutality of her methods had sent clear messages to other tribal groups about the futility of resistance to Kievan authority, while demonstrating the sophisticated planning and logistical capabilities that made her forces far more dangerous than traditional raiding parties or temporary military alliances. The princess's subsequent conversion to Christianity around 957 CE represented a dramatic transformation that seemed to contradict everything about her previous career. Her journey to Constantinople for baptism, her adoption of the Christian name Helena, and her efforts to promote Christian missionary activity throughout Kievan Rus suggested a fundamental change in both her personal beliefs and her approach to governance. Yet this apparent contradiction between her early career as a mass murderer and her later reputation for piety reflected the complex relationship between violence and sanctity that characterized medieval Christian political culture. Olga's eventual canonization as a saint by the Orthodox Church, despite the undeniable brutality of her campaigns against the Drevlians, demonstrated the Church's recognition that her actions had served essential political and religious purposes. Her elimination of pagan tribal leadership had cleared the way for Christian evangelization, while her consolidation of Kievan political authority had created the unified state that would eventually become the foundation for Orthodox Christianity's expansion throughout Eastern Europe. The historical assessment of Olga's career would remain complex and controversial, balancing her undeniable achievements as a state builder and religious innovator against the massive human cost of her campaigns of vengeance. Her methods had been undeniably brutal, involving the systematic murder of thousands of people whose only crime was their political allegiance to leaders who had challenged Kievan authority. Yet these same methods had also established the political foundations for one of medieval Europe's most successful states, while creating the conditions that would allow Christianity to flourish throughout the region. Perhaps most remarkably, Olga's transformation from vengeful widow to Orthodox saint demonstrated the possibility of radical, personal change, even among individuals who had committed acts of extraordinary violence. Her later years, marked by efforts to promote peaceful trade relationships and Christian missionary activity, suggested that even the most hardened practitioners of political murder could find redemption through religious conversion and constructive governance. This theme of redemption through faith would become central to her legendary status, allowing later generations to celebrate her achievements while minimizing the uncomfortable realities of how those achievements had been accomplished. Isabella of France. In the fog-shrouded chambers of medieval Westminster, where the court of Edward II conducted its business amid an atmosphere of barely concealed contempt and growing political crisis, a French princess was learning that survival in English politics required skills that no amount of diplomatic training could provide. Isabella of France, who would earn the epithet she-wolf from later chroniclers, was about to demonstrate that a woman scorned by both her husband's sexual preferences and his political incompetence could become one of the most effective military commanders and ruthless political operators of the 14th century. The England that Isabella entered through marriage in 1308 was a kingdom in the midst of a constitutional crisis that had been building for decades. Edward II's reign had begun with the same problems that had plagued his father's later years: military failures in Scotland, baronial opposition to royal policies, and most dangerously, the king's tendency to elevate personal favorites to positions of power and influence that exceeded their abilities and generated resentment among the established nobility. What made Edward II's situation even more precarious was his apparent indifference to the traditional expectations of medieval kingship, including his obligations to produce heirs and maintain the dignity appropriate to his royal status. Isabella's marriage to Edward had been arranged as part of the complex diplomatic negotiations that were supposed to resolve the long-standing conflicts between England and France over territories in Gascony and other continental possessions. As the daughter of Philip IV of France, one of medieval Europe's most successful and ruthless monarchs, she brought to the marriage not only substantial dowry payments, but also the political sophistication that came from growing up in a court where the systematic elimination of enemies was considered a normal tool of statecraft. The young queen's initial years in England were marked by her efforts to fulfill the traditional role of a medieval consort while adapting to the peculiar challenges created by her husband's personality and political situation. She bore Edward 4 children, including the future Edward III, thereby securing the dynastic succession that was her primary obligation as queen. More importantly, she demonstrated the political intelligence that would later make her such a formidable opponent, carefully cultivating relationships with baronial families while avoiding the kind of partisan involvement that might have made her a target for those who opposed the king's policies. But Isabella's transformation from dutiful queen to revolutionary leader began with her growing awareness of the true nature of her husband's relationship with Piers Gaveston, the Gascon knight, whose elevation to the earldom of Cornwall and whose apparent influence over royal policy had created the baronial opposition that dominated English politics during the early years of Edward's reign. The king's treatment of Gaveston, which contemporary chroniclers described in language that left little doubt about its sexual nature, represented not only a personal humiliation for Isabella, but also a fundamental violation of the marriage contract that had brought her to England. The execution of Gaveston in 1312, carried out by baronial opponents who had grown tired of attempting to limit his influence through legal means, provided Isabella with temporary relief from the most visible symbol of her marital humiliation. But the king's subsequent elevation of Hugh Despenser the Younger to a similar position of favor and influence demonstrated that Gaveston's death had resolved none of the fundamental problems that were destroying both Edward's marriage and his kingdom. Despenser's rise to power during the late 1310s created even more serious challenges for Isabella than Gaveston's earlier influence had posed. Unlike Gaveston, who had been content to enjoy royal favor without attempting to build an independent power base, Despenser used his access to the king to construct a network of supporters and accumulate territories that made him the effective ruler of England, while reducing Edward to a figurehead whose primary function was to legitimize his favorite's policies. The Queen's opposition to Despenser reflected both personal resentment and political calculation. As the younger Despenser consolidated his control over royal administration and accumulated wealth through the confiscation of baronial estates, he systematically excluded Isabella from the influence and patronage that should have been hers by right as queen. More dangerously, his policies were creating the kind of baronial opposition that had led to civil war during previous reigns, threatening the stability of the kingdom and the future prospects of Isabella's children. Isabella's decision to openly challenge Despenser's authority marked the beginning of the most remarkable military and political campaign conducted by any medieval queen. Her initial strategy was diplomatic, focusing on building alliances with French and papal officials who might pressure Edward to moderate his policies and restore some balance to English government. But when these efforts failed to produce meaningful results, she began planning the more direct action that would eventually overthrow both Despenser and her husband. The Queen's opportunity came in 1325, when she was sent to France to negotiate with her brother Charles IV about territorial disputes in Gascony. Rather than simply conducting the diplomatic business that had occasioned her journey, she used her time in Paris to organize the invasion that would transform English politics and establish her as one of medieval Europe's most successful female military commanders. The coalition that Isabella assembled in France demonstrated both her political sophistication and her understanding of how to exploit the weaknesses in Edward's position. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer, the exiled English baron who had escaped from the Tower of London and possessed both the military expertise and the domestic connections necessary to challenge royal authority, provided her with the strategic leadership that her campaign required. Meanwhile, her cultivation of support among other English exiles and continental allies ensured that her invasion would have the resources and legitimacy necessary to succeed. The invasion fleet that sailed from the Low Countries in September 1326 was relatively small, comprising perhaps 1,500 men-at-arms and additional support personnel. But Isabella's strategy did not depend on overwhelming military force. Instead, she had correctly calculated that Edward's unpopularity and Despenser's accumulated enemies would provide her with the domestic support necessary to transform a foreign invasion into a popular uprising against royal misgovernment. The campaign that followed demonstrated Isabella's remarkable abilities as both a military strategist and a political propagandist. Rather than attempting to capture London immediately or engaging Edward's forces in conventional battle, she conducted a systematic advance through the English countryside that allowed her to gather support while avoiding the kind of destructive warfare that might have alienated potential allies. Her proclamations, which emphasized her role as a wronged wife, seeking to protect her children's inheritance rather than as a foreign invader seeking to conquer England, proved remarkably effective in building the popular support that made her ultimate victory possible. The collapse of Edward's resistance was so rapid and complete that it surprised even Isabella's supporters. Within months of her landing, the king and Despenser were fugitives in their own kingdom, while baronial families that had remained neutral or even hostile to her cause were declaring their support for her regency. The capture of Edward and Despenser in Wales in November 1326 marked the effective end of a reign that had lasted 20 years but had never successfully established the authority and legitimacy that effective medieval kingship required. But Isabella's most controversial decision was yet to come. The deposition of Edward II in favor of his 14-year-old son Edward III created a new set of political challenges that required her to balance the competing demands of legitimacy, security, and practical governance. The continued existence of the deposed king represented a potential focal point for opposition to her regency, while his treatment would establish important precedents for how English political culture would handle future constitutional crises. The mysterious death of Edward II at Berkeley Castle in September 1327, officially attributed to natural causes but widely believed to have resulted from murder, marked both the climax of Isabella's campaign and the beginning of the historical controversy that would surround her legacy for centuries. While no definitive evidence linked her directly to her husband's death, the circumstances of his demise and the political benefits it provided to her regency left little doubt about her ultimate responsibility for the crime. The method allegedly used to kill Edward, insertion of a red-hot iron poker into his bowels, was designed to leave no external marks, while causing excruciating pain that would serve as both execution and symbolic punishment for his perceived sexual deviance. Whether this gruesome death actually occurred as later chroniclers described, or whether Edward died from more conventional causes, the story became central to Isabella's reputation as the she-wolf, whose maternal devotion and political ambition had driven her to commit the ultimate violation of the marriage bond. Isabella's regency for Edward III, lasting from 1327 to 1330, demonstrated both her administrative competence and the fundamental instability of power, built primarily on military conquest and the elimination of rivals. Her policies during this period focused on restoring the baronial support that Edward II's reign had alienated, while maintaining England's continental interests and managing the complex relationship with Scotland that had dominated English foreign policy for decades. But the regency also revealed the limitations of Isabella's position as a woman ruling in a political system that remained fundamentally patriarchal despite its occasional tolerance for exceptional female leadership. Her relationship with Roger Mortimer, while providing her with essential military and political support, also created vulnerabilities that her enemies could exploit by questioning the legitimacy of their personal alliance and its impact on royal policy. The end of Isabella's political career came in 1330, when Edward III, now 18 years old and eager to assert his own authority, staged a coup that eliminated Mortimer and forced his mother into retirement. The young king's actions were motivated by both personal resentment about his continued subordination to his mother's authority and political calculation about the need to establish his own independent legitimacy as ruler. Mortimer's execution and Isabella's forced retirement to Castle Rising marked the end of one of the most remarkable political careers achieved by any medieval woman. But it also demonstrated the ultimate futility of power, built primarily on military conquest and personal alliance. Her achievements, the successful invasion of England, the deposition of an ineffective king, and the establishment of a regency that maintained political stability during a crucial transitional period, were undeniable, but they had been accomplished through methods that created lasting resentments and fundamental questions about the legitimacy of female rule. Isabella's final years, spent in comfortable but enforced retirement, allowed later chroniclers to construct narratives about her career that emphasized either her political achievements or her personal crimes, depending on their own ideological perspectives. The she-wolf epithet, probably invented by Tudor propagandists seeking to contrast her unfavorably with more recent queens, captured the ambivalence that medieval political culture felt about women who successfully employed violence and military force to achieve their objectives. Joanna I of Naples. In the sun-drenched palaces of 14th-century Naples, where the Angevin court maintained its claims to dominion over much of southern Italy, while navigating the treacherous currents of papal politics and Hungarian royal ambitions, a young queen was about to become embroiled in a murder that would define both her reign and her historical reputation. Joanna of Naples, whose 40-year rule would encompass plague, civil war, and constant accusations of regicide, would demonstrate that survival in the murderous world of late medieval Italian politics required skills that no amount of royal education could adequately provide. The kingdom of Naples that Joanna inherited in 1343 was both one of medieval Europe's wealthiest states and one of its most politically unstable. A realm where Angevin claims to legitimacy rested uneasily on top of complex networks of noble families, merchant communities, and ecclesiastical institutions that maintained their own independent sources of power and influence. Into this world of competing jurisdictions and overlapping loyalties, Joanna had been born in 1326. Heir to a dynasty that had ruled southern Italy for less than a century, but had already experienced more than its share of political violence and dynastic intrigue. Joanna's path to the throne had been complicated by the gender-neutral inheritance laws that the Angevine dynasty had adopted to prevent the kind of succession disputes that had plagued other medieval kingdoms, but which also created opportunities for rival claimants to challenge female rule on both legal and cultural grounds. Her marriage to Andrew of Hungary in 1333, arranged when both parties were children to cement the alliance between the Angevin branches that ruled Naples and Hungary, was intended to resolve these potential conflicts while providing the kingdom with effective male leadership during Joanna's minority. But the marriage that was supposed to ensure political stability instead became the source of the most serious crisis of Joanna's early reign. Andrew, supported by Hungarian advisors and backed by his mother Elizabeth's formidable political network, began asserting claims to independent royal authority that went far beyond the traditional role of a queen's consort. His demands for coronation as king in his own right represented not only a personal challenge to Joanna's inherited position, but also a fundamental threat to the political coalition that had supported Angevin rule for decades. The conflict between the royal spouses reflected broader tensions within the Neapolitan political system about the appropriate relationship between Hungarian and local interests, between royal authority and noble privilege, and most fundamentally, between traditional expectations of male rule and the practical realities of female succession. Andrew's Hungarian supporters, convinced that their prince's royal blood gave him stronger claims to the throne than his wife's inheritance, began systematically excluding Joanna from important policy decisions while building their own independent power base among those noble families that preferred Hungarian to local Angevin leadership. Joanna's response to these challenges demonstrated both her political sophistication and her growing willingness to employ extreme measures to protect her position. Rather than accepting a subordinate role in her own kingdom or attempting to negotiate some power-sharing arrangement that might have preserved her marriage while limiting her authority, she chose to ally herself with those noble families and court officials who viewed Hungarian influence as a threat to their own interests and to the kingdom's independence. The conspiracy that developed around the elimination of Andrew involved some of the most powerful figures in Neapolitan politics, including members of Joanna's own family, who had concluded that the Hungarian prince's continued existence represented an unacceptable threat to the established order. The planning for his assassination demonstrated both the sophistication of late medieval political intrigue and the extent to which violence had become normalized as a tool for resolving dynastic disputes. On the night of September 18, 1345, Andrew was murdered at the royal hunting lodge of Aversa, strangled with a silk cord and hanged from a balcony in a manner designed to suggest suicide, while sending clear messages about the fate awaiting those who challenged established authority. The murder itself was accomplished with professional efficiency, but the broader conspiracy that surrounded it revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Joanna's political position. The immediate aftermath of Andrew's death demonstrated both the effectiveness of the conspiracy and the fundamental problems it created for Joanna's long-term security. While the elimination of her husband removed the most immediate threat to her independent authority, it also provided her enemies with powerful ammunition for questioning both her personal morality and her fitness to rule. The circumstances of the murder, particularly the apparent coordination between multiple conspirators and the symbolic messages embedded in its execution, left little doubt about the level of planning that had preceded Andrew's death. More problematically, Andrew's murder triggered a diplomatic crisis that would dominate Neapolitan politics for the remainder of Joanna's reign. Louis of Hungary, Andrew's brother and one of medieval Europe's most successful military commanders, declared his intention to avenge the murder while advancing his own claims to the Neapolitan throne. The prospect of Hungarian invasion forced Joanna to seek protection from the Pope and other Italian powers, transforming what had begun as a domestic political dispute into a broader conflict about the balance of power in southern Italy. The papal investigation that followed Andrew's murder provided Joanna with her first opportunity to demonstrate the political skills that would characterize her long reign. Rather than simply denying involvement in her husband's death or attempting to prevent serious inquiry into the circumstances surrounding it, she actively cooperated with papal investigators while using the investigation itself as a platform for presenting her case against Hungarian interference in Neapolitan affairs. Joanna's journey to Avignon in 1348 to personally answer the charges against her represented one of the most remarkable episodes in medieval diplomatic history. Her decision to place herself voluntarily under papal jurisdiction while her kingdom faced invasion from Hungarian forces demonstrated both her confidence in her ability to manipulate ecclesiastical politics and her understanding that papal support was essential for her long-term survival as an independent ruler. The Queen's defense against the murder charges combined legal sophistication with political pragmatism in ways that revealed her growing mastery of the complex relationships between secular and ecclesiastical authority that characterized late medieval Italian politics. Rather than simply claiming innocence, she presented detailed arguments about the circumstances that had made Andrew's elimination politically necessary, while emphasizing her continued loyalty to papal authority and her commitment to maintaining the kingdom's traditional relationship with the Church. Pope Clement VI's eventual acquittal of Joanna in 1352 reflected both the persuasiveness of her defense and the Pope's own political calculations about the benefits of maintaining an independent Neapolitan kingdom as a counterweight to Hungarian and imperial ambitions in Italy. The papal decision provided Joanna with the legitimacy she needed to resist Hungarian invasion, while establishing important precedents about the relationship between royal authority and ecclesiastical oversight. But Joanna's vindication in the Andrew case did not end the violence that would characterize her long reign. Her subsequent marriages, first to Louis of Taranto and later to James of Majorca and Otto of Brunswick, were all marked by political intrigue and personal conflict that reflected the fundamental instability of her position as a female ruler in a political system that remained uncomfortable with independent female authority. The Queen's treatment of her later husbands revealed both her growing confidence in her own authority and her willingness to employ increasingly extreme measures to maintain her independence. Louis of Taranto, whose marriage to Joanna was intended to provide her with military support against Hungarian invasion, found himself systematically excluded from meaningful participation in royal governance, while being expected to provide the military leadership that the kingdom's defense required. More ominously, the mysterious circumstances surrounding the deaths of several of Joanna's close associates and potential rivals suggested that the methods used against Andrew had become standard tools of Neapolitan political management. Court officials who questioned the Queen's policies or showed too much independence found themselves dying under suspicious circumstances, while noble families that supported alternative claimants to the throne discovered that royal favor could shift with deadly suddenness. The Black Death pandemic that struck Naples in 1348 provided Joanna with both new challenges and new opportunities for consolidating her authority. The massive mortality that accompanied the plague eliminated many of the noble families and court officials who had opposed her policies, while the social and economic disruption that followed the pandemic allowed her to implement administrative reforms that strengthened royal authority at the expense of traditional noble privileges. Joanna's response to the plague demonstrated both her administrative competence and her understanding of how crisis situations could be exploited to advance political objectives. Her policies during the pandemic focused on maintaining essential services and preventing social collapse while using the emergency powers that the crisis justified to eliminate remaining sources of opposition to her rule. The final phase of Joanna's reign, lasting from the 1360s until her death in 1382 saw her transform from a young queen accused of murdering her husband into one of medieval Europe's most experienced and effective female rulers. Her court became a center of artistic and intellectual patronage that attracted scholars and artists from throughout Europe, while her diplomatic skills allowed her to maintain Neapolitan independence, despite constant pressure from Hungarian, imperial, and papal forces. But Joanna's ultimate fate demonstrated the fundamental vulnerability that had characterized her entire reign. Her death in 1382, officially attributed to natural causes, but widely believed to have resulted from murder ordered by her rival Charles of Durazzo, marked the end of the most successful period of female rule in Neapolitan history, while illustrating the continuing dangers faced by women who attempted to exercise independent political authority in late medieval Europe. The circumstances of Joanna's death, smothered in her bed by assassins who had gained access to her chambers through the cooperation of trusted servants, provided a grimly appropriate conclusion to a reign that had begun with accusations of regicide and had been marked throughout by the systematic elimination of political rivals. Her murder represented both personal revenge for decades of conflict and political calculation about the need to establish more traditional forms of male authority in the kingdom. Joanna's historical reputation would remain controversial for centuries after her death, with some chroniclers emphasizing her political achievements and cultural patronage, while others focused on the violence that had marked her rise to power and characterized her methods of governance. But perhaps her most significant legacy was her demonstration that even women, accused of the most heinous crimes, could achieve remarkable political success when they possessed the intelligence, determination, and ruthlessness that effective medieval leadership required. Isabella, I of Castile. In the fortress-like alcazars of 15th-century Castile, where Christian knights planned the final campaigns that would drive Islamic rule from the Iberian Peninsula after nearly 8 centuries of warfare, a young queen was preparing to orchestrate a triumph that would reshape the religious and political landscape of Europe, while establishing new standards for the systematic elimination of entire populations. Isabella of Castile, whose marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon would unite Spain's 2 most powerful kingdoms, would earn her place among history's most murderous rulers, not through individual assassinations or palace coups, but through her role in creating the institutional machinery of genocide that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives in the name of religious purity. The Spain that Isabella inherited through her contested succession to the Castilian throne in 1474 was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, religious communities, and cultural traditions that had coexisted uneasily since the Islamic conquest of 711 CE. The Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive Muslim rulers from the peninsula, had succeeded in reducing Islamic territory to the single kingdom of Granada, but it had also created a complex society where Christians, Muslims, and Jews had developed sophisticated systems of coexistence, despite their fundamental religious differences. Isabella's path to the throne had been complicated by the succession dispute that followed the death of her half-brother Henry IV in 1474, a conflict that reflected broader tensions within Castilian society about the appropriate direction of royal policy and the kingdom's relationship with its non-Christian populations. Her victory in the civil war that followed Henry's death, achieved through a combination of military skill, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic alliance with Aragonese forces, established her authority while creating the political conditions that would make her subsequent campaigns of religious persecution both possible and seemingly necessary. The Queen's marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 had been arranged not only to unite the 2 kingdoms, but also to create the unified military and administrative structure necessary to complete the Reconquista and address what both monarchs viewed as the growing threat posed by religious diversity to Christian political authority. Their partnership, celebrated by later historians as one of the most successful royal marriages in European history, was built on shared commitment to creating a unified Spain that would be both territorially complete and religiously homogeneous. Isabella's approach to the final conquest of Granada demonstrated both her military sophistication and her understanding that effective warfare in the late 15th century required not only traditional siege tactics, but also the basiege, systematic destruction of the economic and social structures that supported enemy resistance. The 10-year campaign that culminated in Granada's surrender in 1492 was marked by innovations in artillery, logistics, and siege warfare that would influence European military development for centuries. But more importantly for Isabella's historical reputation, the Granada campaign established the precedents and institutional mechanisms that would make her subsequent persecution of Spain's religious minorities both practically feasible and ideologically justified. The Queen's treatment of conquered Muslim populations during the war demonstrated her willingness to employ methods that went far beyond traditional military necessity, including the systematic destruction of mosques, the forced conversion of civilian populations, and the mass enslavement of those who resisted Christian authority. The surrender terms negotiated for Granada in 1492, which initially promised that Muslim residents could maintain their religion, property, and legal traditions under Christian rule, represented a temporary tactical compromise rather than Isabella's ultimate objectives for Spain's Islamic population. The Queen's subsequent abandonment of these agreements and her implementation of increasingly harsh policies designed to force conversion or emigration revealed both her fundamental dishonesty in diplomatic negotiations and her systematic approach to what would later be recognized as ethnic cleansing. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, authorized by papal bull at Isabella's request, provided the institutional framework necessary for the systematic persecution of Spain's conversos Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but remained suspect in the eyes of religious authorities. The Inquisition's methods, which included torture, property confiscation, and public execution, were designed not only to identify and punish heretics, but also to create a climate of terror that would ensure the conformity of Spain's entire population to Orthodox Catholic doctrine. Isabella's personal involvement in the Inquisition's operations demonstrated both her administrative competence and her complete commitment to the elimination of religious diversity from her kingdoms. Rather than delegating the persecution of heretics to ecclesiastical authorities or treating it as a secondary priority, she made the Inquisition a central focus of royal policy, while ensuring that its operations were coordinated with broader political and military objectives. The Queen's most notorious act of religious persecution, the expulsion of Spain's Jewish population in 1492, represented the culmination of her campaign to create a religiously unified kingdom, while demonstrating her willingness to sacrifice economic prosperity and social stability for ideological objectives. The Edict of Expulsion, announced just months after Granada's surrender, gave Spain's Jewish communities the choice between conversion to Christianity or permanent exile, effectively eliminating a population that had contributed to Iberian civilization for over a millennium. The implementation of the expulsion revealed both the efficiency of Isabella's administrative machinery and the systematic nature of her approach to population elimination. The logistics of forcing perhaps 200,000 people to abandon their homes, businesses, and possessions within a matter of months required coordination between royal officials, local authorities, and ecclesiastical institutions that demonstrated the Queen's ability to mobilize her entire governmental apparatus in service of religious persecution. The human cost of Isabella's policies during this period was staggering even by the standards of an age accustomed to religious warfare and dynastic violence. Conservative estimates suggest that over 100,000 Muslims and Jews were killed during the final conquest of Granada and its aftermath, while hundreds of thousands more were forced into exile or conversion under circumstances that constituted systematic persecution. The economic and cultural losses inflicted on Spanish society through these policies would influence the kingdom's development for centuries. But perhaps most chilling was Isabella's systematic approach to the elimination of Islamic and Jewish cultural heritage from the territories under her control. Her campaigns included not only the persecution of people, but also the destruction of libraries, the burning of books written in Arabic and Hebrew, and the systematic obliteration of architectural and artistic monuments that testified to Spain's multicultural past. This cultural genocide was designed to ensure that future generations would have no physical reminders of the religious diversity that had characterized medieval Iberia. The Queen's methods extended beyond direct violence to encompass more subtle but equally effective forms of persecution, designed to make life impossible for those religious minorities who had managed to avoid immediate expulsion or execution. The legal and social restrictions imposed on conversos created conditions that made normal economic and social activity nearly impossible, while the constant threat of inquisitorial investigation ensured that even those who had genuinely converted to Christianity lived in constant fear of denunciation and persecution. Isabella's role in launching Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas in 1492 was directly connected to her domestic policies of religious persecution, as the wealth generated by Atlantic exploration was intended to compensate for the economic losses created by the expulsion of Spain's Jewish and Muslim populations. The coincidence of dates, the fall of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews, and Columbus's first voyage all occurred in 1492 reflected the Queen's systematic approach to transforming Spain from a multicultural kingdom into a unified Catholic state capable of expanding its influence throughout the known world. The colonial policies that Isabella established for Spain's American territories extended the same logic of religious persecution and cultural elimination that had characterized her domestic policies, creating institutional frameworks for the systematic exploitation and conversion of indigenous populations that would influence European colonialism for centuries. Her role in authorizing the enslavement of Native Americans and her support for missionary activities designed to eliminate indigenous religious practices demonstrated that her commitment to religious uniformity extended far beyond borders of the Iberian Peninsula. The Queen's final years, lasting from the completion of the Reconquista in 1492 until her death in 1504, were marked by efforts to consolidate the religious and political unity that her campaigns of persecution had been designed to achieve. Her administrative reforms during this period focused on creating more centralized governmental institutions while ensuring that the Inquisition's surveillance and enforcement capabilities could be maintained without constant royal oversight. Isabella's death in 1504 marked the end of the most systematic campaign of religious persecution conducted by any European ruler during the late medieval period, but it also represented the beginning of a new phase of Spanish history in which the institutions and precedents she had established would continue to influence policy for centuries. The unified Spain that emerged from her reign was both more powerful and more culturally homogeneous than the kingdom she had inherited, but it had achieved this unity through methods that would later be recognized as crimes against humanity. The historical assessment of Isabella's reign has remained controversial, with Catholic historians traditionally emphasizing her role in completing the Reconquista and strengthening Spanish unity, while more recent scholarship has focused on the massive human cost of her policies and their role in establishing precedents for later European colonialism and genocide. Her canonization process, initiated by the Catholic Church in the late 20th century, was eventually suspended due to concerns about her treatment of religious minorities, reflecting growing recognition that her methods could not be justified even by the religious and political standards of her own time. Perhaps Isabella's most troubling legacy lies not in the immediate consequences of her actions, but in the institutional and ideological precedents she established for the systematic persecution of religious and ethnic minorities. Her demonstration that modern administrative techniques could be employed to achieve the complete elimination of unwanted populations would influence European political development in ways that extended far beyond the borders of Spain. The confines of the late medieval period. Catherine de' Medici. In the opulent galleries of 16th-century French royal palaces, where the scent of perfumed courtiers mingled with the constant undercurrent of religious and political tension, a Florentine banker's daughter was learning that survival as a foreign queen in France would require her to master the arts of political manipulation and strategic violence that her Medici ancestors had perfected during their rise to power in Renaissance Italy. Catherine de' Medici, whose name would become synonymous with the darkest episodes of France's wars of religion, would demonstrate that maternal devotion and political necessity could justify acts of mass murder that shocked even an age accustomed to casual brutality. The France that Catherine entered through marriage to the future Henry II in 1533 was a kingdom that appeared to be at the height of its power and influence, controlling vast territories, maintaining one of Europe's most sophisticated courts, and challenging Habsburg dominance throughout the continent. But beneath this facade of strength and unity, French society was becoming increasingly divided by religious conflicts that would eventually tear the kingdom apart and transform its political culture in ways that contemporaries could barely comprehend. Catherine's position as a foreign queen was complicated by the circumstances of her family background and the complex web of Italian politics that had shaped her early education. As a member of the Medici banking dynasty, she brought to France not only substantial financial resources, but also the political sophistication that came from growing up in a society where commercial success and political survival required constant adaptation to changing circumstances and the elimination of competitors through whatever means proved most effective. The young queen's initial years in France were marked by her efforts to establish herself within a court culture that remained fundamentally suspicious of foreign influence, while demonstrating the political acumen that would eventually make her one of the most effective rulers of her generation. Her marriage to Henry II provided her with the platform necessary to build alliances and accumulate influence, but it also placed her in direct competition with Diane de Poitiers, the king's mistress, whose political connections and personal influence far exceeded those of the official queen. Catherine's transformation from marginalized foreign consort to the dominant figure in French politics began with Henry II's accidental death in 1559, an event that thrust her into the role of Queen Mother, responsible for protecting her minor son's inheritance against the ambitions of rival noble families and competing religious factions. The regency she established for the 15-year-old Francis II demonstrated both her political sophistication and her willingness to employ increasingly extreme measures to maintain royal authority in a kingdom that was sliding toward civil war. The religious conflicts that would define Catherine's career as regent and Queen Mother reflected broader tensions within French society about the appropriate relationship between royal authority and religious orthodoxy, between traditional Catholic institutions and the growing influence of Protestant reformers, and most fundamentally, between competing visions of what constituted legitimate political authority in a Christian kingdom. Catherine's approach to these conflicts was shaped by her Italian background and her understanding that effective political management in a religiously divided society required flexibility, strategic alliances with competing factions, and above all, the willingness to sacrifice principles for practical advantage. Her policies during the early phases of the wars of religion demonstrated both her sophisticated grasp of the political dynamics that were tearing France apart and her growing conviction that only extreme measures could preserve the monarchy's authority. The Queen Mother's establishment of her flying squadron, a network of beautiful and sophisticated women who served as both intelligence agents and diplomatic intermediaries, represented one of her most innovative contributions to the development of early modern statecraft. These women, recruited from noble families throughout France and trained in the arts of seduction and political manipulation, provided Catherine with unprecedented access to information about the plans and vulnerabilities of her enemies, while allowing her to influence political developments through methods that left no obvious fingerprints. But Catherine's most notorious act of political violence, her role in orchestrating the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1,570 Would demonstrate both the extremes to which she was willing to go to protect her family's position and the fundamental failure of her strategy of maintaining royal authority through one's systematic elimination of opposition. The massacre, which began as a targeted assassination campaign against Protestant leaders and escalated into a general slaughter that claimed thousands of lives, represented the culmination of her efforts to resolve France's religious conflicts through decisive action. The planning for St. Bartholomew's Day revealed both Catherine's growing desperation about the political situation and her sophisticated understanding of how to coordinate complex operations involving multiple participants with potentially conflicting objectives. The massacre was timed to coincide with the wedding of Catherine's daughter Marguerite to the Protestant leader Henry of Navarre, an event that had brought the kingdom's most prominent Protestant nobles to Paris and placed them in a position where they could be eliminated efficiently and with minimal warning. The signal for the massacre, the ringing of the bell at the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois in the early hours of August 24, 1572, launched a coordinated assault on Protestant leaders that had been planned with military precision and executed with ruthless efficiency. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most prominent Protestant military commander, was among the first victims. Thrown from his window after being stabbed and shot by assassins who had gained access to his lodgings through the cooperation of Catholic nobles, who had convinced him that his safety was guaranteed by the royal wedding. But the systematic nature of the killing that followed Coligny's assassination demonstrated that Catherine's objectives extended far beyond the elimination of specific individuals to encompass the destruction of Protestant political organization throughout France. The lists of targets that had been prepared in advance included not only prominent nobles and military commanders, but also merchants, artisans, and intellectuals whose influence was considered dangerous to Catholic unity and royal authority. The massacre's expansion beyond its original targets to include ordinary Protestant civilians reflected both the success of Catherine's propaganda efforts and the uncontrollable nature of the violence she had unleashed. The systematic identification and murder of Protestants throughout Paris demonstrated the effectiveness of the intelligence networks she had spent years developing, while the participation of ordinary Catholic citizens in the killing revealed the extent to which religious hatred had penetrated French society at every level. Contemporary estimates of the death toll from St. Bartholomew's Day and its aftermath range from 3,000 to 5,000 in Paris alone, with additional thousands killed in provincial cities throughout France, as news of the massacre spread and local Catholic authorities implemented their own versions of Catherine's solution to the Protestant problem. The scale of the killing represented one of the largest episodes of religious violence in European history and established precedents for systematic persecution that would influence political development throughout the continent. Catherine's immediate response to the massacre demonstrated both her political sophistication and her recognition that the violence had exceeded her original intentions in ways that created new problems for royal authority. Her efforts to present the killings as a spontaneous popular uprising against Protestant treason rather than acknowledging her own role in planning and coordinating the operation, reflected her understanding that the monarchy's legitimacy depended on maintaining the fiction that royal authority was exercised in defense of public order rather than private interest. The international reaction to St. Bartholomew's Day revealed both the success and failure of Catherine's strategy for resolving France's religious conflicts. Catholic powers throughout Europe, including Spain and the Papal States, celebrated the massacre as a decisive blow against Protestant heresy and evidence of French commitment to Catholic unity. But Protestant nations, particularly England and the German principalities, viewed the killings as evidence of French duplicity and as a warning about the dangers of trusting Catholic promises of religious tolerance. Perhaps more problematically for Catherine's long-term objectives, the massacre failed to achieve its primary goal of eliminating Protestant political organization and military capability. While the killings had eliminated many prominent Protestant leaders and created a climate of terror that forced others into exile or hiding, they had also radicalized surviving Protestant communities and provided them with powerful symbols of Catholic persecution that could be used to justify continued resistance to royal authority. The final phase of Catherine's career, lasting from the immediate aftermath of St. Bartholomew's Day until her death in 1589, demonstrated both her continued political sophistication and the fundamental failure of her strategy for managing religious conflict through systematic violence. Her efforts to rebuild some form of political consensus in France required her to distance herself from the massacre while simultaneously maintaining the support of Catholic extremists who viewed the killings as the beginning rather than the end of what was necessary to achieve religious unity. Catherine's relationship with her third son, Henry III, who became king after the death of Charles IX in 1574, revealed both her continued influence over royal policy and the growing limitations of her authority as France's political situation deteriorated further. Henry III's efforts to assert his own independent authority while managing the competing demands of Catholic and Protestant factions created new sources of conflict that Catherine's traditional methods of political manipulation proved inadequate to resolve. The emergence of the Catholic League as an independent political force during the 1580s represented the ultimate failure of Catherine's strategy for maintaining royal control over religious policy. The League, led by the Guise family and supported by Spain, challenged royal authority from a Catholic perspective while demanding even more extreme measures against Protestant communities than those Catherine had already implemented. The existence of organized Catholic opposition to royal policy demonstrated that her massacre had created as many enemies as it had eliminated. Catherine's death in 1589, coming just months before Henry III's own assassination by a Catholic extremist, marked the end of the most violent phase of France's wars of religion, while illustrating the ultimate futility of attempting to resolve religious conflicts through systematic elimination of opposition. Her legacy encompassed both her remarkable achievements as a political manager and strategic thinker, and the massive human cost of the methods she had employed to protect her family's position and maintain royal authority. The historical assessment of Catherine's career has remained controversial, with some historians emphasizing her political skills and her efforts to preserve French unity during a period of unprecedented crisis, while others have focused on her role in orchestrating one of the most notorious episodes of religious persecution in European history. Her example would influence later discussions about the appropriate limits of royal authority and the relationship between political necessity and moral constraints in situations where the survival of established institutions appeared to be at stake. Perhaps Catherine's most troubling legacy lies in her demonstration that sophisticated political intelligence and systematic planning could be employed to achieve the mass murder of religious minorities while maintaining the facades of legitimate government and religious orthodoxy. Her methods established precedents for state-sponsored terrorism that would influence European political development for centuries, while her failure to achieve lasting political stability through violence illustrated the fundamental limitations of coercion as a tool for managing complex social and religious conflicts. Mary, I of England. In the stone chambers of Tudor palaces, where the morning light filtered through windows that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the daughter of Henry VIII was preparing to restore the Catholic faith to England through methods that would earn her the epithet Bloody Mary and establish her as one of history's most systematically murderous rulers. Mary Tudor's 5-year reign would be marked not by the individual assassinations or palace coups that characterized other royal killers, but by the methodical burning of nearly 300 Protestant reformers in a campaign of religious persecution that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to the casual brutalities of 16th century politics. The England that Mary inherited upon her accession in 1553 was a kingdom that had been transformed by 2 decades of religious revolution, initiated by her father's break with Rome and continued through the Protestant reforms, implemented during her half-brother Edward VI's reign. The systematic destruction of Catholic institutions, the confiscation of monastic properties, and the execution of prominent Catholic leaders had created a religious landscape that bore little resemblance to the medieval church in which Mary had been raised and to which she remained passionately committed throughout her life. Mary's path to the throne had been complicated by the succession disputes that followed Henry VIII's death and his attempts to manipulate the royal inheritance through his will and parliamentary legislation. Her legitimacy as heir to the crown had been questioned due to her parents' annulled marriage, while her Catholic faith made her unacceptable to the Protestant political establishment that had consolidated its power during Edward VI's minority. Her successful claim to the throne in 1553, achieved through a combination of popular support and military action against Lady Jane Grey's brief usurpation, demonstrated both her political determination and the continued strength of Catholic sentiment among ordinary English people. The new Queen's initial policies demonstrated both her understanding of the political realities that constrained royal authority and her fundamental commitment to reversing the religious changes that had transformed England during the previous 2 decades. Rather than immediately implementing the comprehensive Catholic restoration that represented her ultimate objective, she initially adopted a moderate approach that focused on repealing the most extreme Protestant legislation, while avoiding direct confrontation with the powerful noble families that had benefited from the confiscation of church properties. But Mary's restraint during the early months of her reign reflected tactical calculation rather than any fundamental moderation in her religious objectives. Her marriage negotiations with Philip II of Spain, announced within months of her accession, revealed both her determination to align England with the Catholic powers of Europe and her willingness to subordinate English interests to her broader religious mission. The marriage treaty, which made Philip co-ruler of England while maintaining Spanish control over foreign policy, demonstrated Mary's understanding that the restoration of Catholicism would require external support and her willingness to compromise English independence to achieve her religious goals. The Queen's decision to begin systematic persecution of Protestant leaders reflected both her growing confidence in her political position and her conviction that religious unity could only be achieved through the elimination of heretical influences that had corrupted English Christianity. The revival of the heresy laws that had been repealed during the previous 2 reigns provided her with the legal framework necessary to begin the campaign of burning that would define her historical reputation, while her coordination with ecclesiastical authorities ensured that the persecution would be conducted with apparent legal legitimacy and religious sanction. The first executions, beginning in February 1555 with the burning of John Rogers at Smithfield, established both the methods and the symbolic messages that would characterize Mary's entire campaign against Protestant heresy. The choice of burning as the preferred method of execution reflected both legal tradition. Heresy had historically been punished by fire and religious symbolism, as the flames were believed to represent the eternal damnation that awaited those who persisted in doctrinal error. The public nature of the executions, conducted in prominent locations throughout England with careful attention to ceremonial details, demonstrated Mary's understanding that the persecution's effectiveness would depend not only on eliminating individual heretics, but also on creating a climate of terror that would discourage others from maintaining Protestant beliefs. The systematic nature of Mary's persecution campaign became apparent through the careful selection of targets that included not only prominent Protestant theologians and clergy, but also ordinary laypeople whose commitment to reformed religion made them symbols of the broader religious resistance that the Queen was determined to eliminate. The burning of bishops like Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley in October 1555 demonstrated her willingness to execute even the most prominent religious leaders, while the inclusion of merchants, artisans, and farmers among the victims revealed the extent to which Protestant beliefs had penetrated English society at every level. Perhaps most revealing of Mary's character and methods was her treatment of Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, whose role in annulling her parents' marriage and establishing Protestant doctrine had made him a personal enemy as well as a religious opponent. Cranmer's prolonged imprisonment, repeated interrogations, and eventual execution in March 1556 demonstrated both the Queen's capacity for personal vindictiveness and her understanding that the psychological destruction of prominent opponents was as important as their physical elimination. The Archbishop's final recantation of his Protestant beliefs followed immediately by his repudiation of that recantation and his dramatic gesture of thrusting his right hand into the flames first because it had signed documents supporting Protestant doctrine, provided Mary's persecution campaign with one of its most powerful symbolic moments, while illustrating the complex psychological dynamics that characterized the entire period. Cranmer's behavior at his execution revealed both the effectiveness of the interrogation techniques employed by Mary's agents and the ultimate failure of those techniques to achieve the genuine conversions that would legitimize the entire campaign. The economic and social costs of Mary's persecution extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass entire communities whose religious leadership had been eliminated and whose economic activities had been disrupted by the constant threat of investigation and denunciation. The burning of Protestant clergy created shortages of educated religious leaders in many regions, while the emigration of prominent Protestant merchants and craftsmen to continental Protestant cities weakened England's commercial and manufacturing capabilities in ways that would influence the kingdom's economic development for decades. More problematically for Mary's long-term objectives, the persecution campaign failed to achieve its primary goal of eliminating Protestant sentiment and restoring genuine Catholic unity to English religious life. Instead of creating the religious consensus that would have legitimized her policies and ensured their continuation after her death, the burnings generated sympathy for the victims while providing Protestant propagandists with powerful martyrdom narratives that could be used to discredit Catholic authority and justify continued resistance to royal religious policies. The Queen's physical and mental health during the final years of her reign reflected both the stress of implementing her persecution campaign and her growing awareness that her policies had failed to achieve their intended objectives. Her phantom pregnancies, which initially raised hopes for a Catholic succession that would ensure the continuation of her religious policies, became sources of additional psychological trauma as it became clear that she would produce no heir to inherit the throne and continue her work of Catholic restoration. Mary's relationship with her half-sister, Elizabeth, whose Protestant sympathies made her the inevitable heir to the throne in the absence of direct issue, created additional sources of tension and anxiety during the Queen's final years. Elizabeth's careful avoidance of any actions that might provide justification for her exclusion from the succession demonstrated both her political sophistication and her understanding that Mary's death would inevitably result in the reversal of Catholic restoration policies. The international dimensions of Mary's persecution campaign reflected both her alignment with Spanish interests and her understanding that English Catholicism could only survive as part of a broader European Catholic revival. Her coordination with Spanish authorities and her support for Habsburg policies in continental Europe demonstrated her willingness to subordinate English independence to religious objectives, while her persecution of Protestant refugees who had sought sanctuary in England revealed her determination to eliminate Protestant influences regardless of diplomatic complications. The failure of Mary's religious policies became apparent even before her death in 1558, as it became clear that 5 years of systematic persecution had strengthened rather than weakened Protestant resistance, while alienating many Catholics who had initially supported her accession. The economic costs of the persecution, combined with the diplomatic isolation that resulted from her alliance with Spain, had weakened England's international position while creating domestic instabilities that threatened the long-term survival of the Tudor dynasty. Mary's death in November 1558 marked the end of the most systematic campaign of religious persecution conducted by any English ruler, but it also represented the beginning of a new phase of English religious development that would be defined by reaction against her methods and objectives. Elizabeth I's accession and her subsequent establishment of a moderate Protestant settlement reflected both the failure of Mary's policies and the continuing strength of Protestant sentiment among the English political establishment and ordinary population. The historical assessment of Mary's reign has remained controversial, with Catholic historians traditionally emphasizing her sincere religious convictions and the political constraints that made persecution seem necessary, while Protestant and secular historians have focused on the human cost of her policies and their ultimate failure to achieve lasting religious change. Her example established important precedents about the relationship between royal authority and religious policy, while demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of using systematic violence to achieve religious and political objectives. Perhaps Mary's most troubling legacy lies in her demonstration that genuine religious conviction could be employed to justify the systematic murder of hundreds of people, while maintaining the forms of legal and ecclesiastical legitimacy. Her methods influenced later discussions about religious tolerance and the appropriate limits of state authority in matters of conscience, while her failure to achieve lasting change through persecution illustrated the fundamental limitations of coercion as a tool for managing complex religious and cultural conflicts.